So I'm not very good with impromptu unless it's technical stuff. So I'll use that. I'll read from the teleprompter that I created on my own. So I would like to thank the brilliant minds and perhaps even more importantly, the very dedicated human beings who, as researchers and practitioners from academia, industry, and government, have gathered here either virtually or in person and will gather here today and tomorrow. We seem to be living in a world of extremes, from weather and climate events to pandemics and warfare, along with policy and economic shocks. What exacerbates these extremes and destroys human souls and property and hampers business continuity and sustainability is how interconnected and interdependent we humans and our systems have become. They say no person is an island, but we find neither are our business supply chains, nor our airports and seaports, nor our communications, water, power, and transit systems, nor, in fact, our nation's Department of Defense installations. How to make our interconnected systems resilient through a holistic vision that integrates natural, human engineered, and social systems is the clear and present grand challenge of our times. This project NICE, or Networked Infrastructure Under Compound Extremes, focuses on aspects of this grand challenge while realizing that the challenge itself is larger than any one project. Our aspiration remains that collectively we, as Homo sapiens, can take steps to address the challenge that we as individuals may not be able to handle on our own. So with that, let me respectfully and with due humility declare this workshop open. I would like to hand the podium to the one person, our technical project manager par excellence, without whom this would not have happened. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow travelers and friends in resilience, let me present Robin Anderson.
Thank you, Dr. Ganguly. And this is not my favorite thing. So if my voice wavers, bear with me, I will get through this. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for all the multitude of emails and being patient with me as we were organizing this. Obviously, most of you know me, but my name is Robin Anderson, and I'll be the moderator and the host for most of the events. Unless Dr. Ganguly steps in, which is very possible. Please don't hesitate if you need anything or have any questions, ask me. My right hand, Gabby over here, is the Northeastern Project meeting planner that has been helping us, and I owe her a complete debt of gratitude for keeping me on track. She's responsible for all the catering orders. So Gabby, thank you so much. Just a few housekeeping notes before I open and describe the NICE workshop. For those of you that need one, the restrooms, if you go out and take 3 lefts, they're on the other side of the floor. If you have any trouble finding them, let me know. In the event of an emergency, the stairwell is right across from the elevator that you brought up. If by chance, knock on wood, we hope there isn't, but if there's an active shooter incident of any kind, we will shelter in place. And Gabby will work with the building management and the emergency personnel to tell us what to do next. We will be recording the sessions. As you can tell that there are cameras and everything in the back. If anyone has any issues with any of their sessions being recorded, please let me know. You can take me off to the side if you'd like and just let me know. But we will be putting the edited videos and slides uploaded on the website as a resource for DoD, SERDP, and the broader community. And just for those of you who have had a chance to look at the website, it is updated to the best of our ability. I know there's been thousands of last-minute changes. So if something has not reached the website and you notice it, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Okay. We have everything in the right order. Networked Infrastructures Under Compound Extremes, or NICE, is a SERDP-funded project in its 3rd year of work, awarded to Northeastern along with the Pacific Northwest National Labs, the University of California at Berkeley, National Research Labs, and the United States Army Corps of Engineers in FY20. During the next 60 minutes or so, you will hear from our lead PIs about their work and the 3 overarching tasks that make up the NICE project. The NICE project aims to ensure mission readiness of installations under combat extremes with internet systems within an installation and its interacting environment. Technology focus for NICE uses a multiplex network science and multi-scale system dynamic approach to installation resilience to these compound extremes. We are aiming for the approach to be generalizable across multiple types of installations. Above all, we want our warfighters, their families, and the places they live and work to be as resilient as possible to compound threats and climate extremes. As we progress through today's presentation, it is my hope that you find our considerations within NICE encompass these areas. So without further ado, please sit back and enjoy the following presentation from our PIs, Auroop, Sam, Latish, Marta, and Ben, who is online, but if the rest of you would join me up here for the first session, they're going to give us the latest on the NICE project. Once we hear from the team, we'll circle back to Auroop, who will summarize the integrated NICE vision, and then we will open it up to questions and answers. So if y'all could hold your Q&A until the end, that would be great. After that, then we'll take a 15-minute break to digest what we've just heard and you can grab more tea. Thank you so much. Ben, Sam, Marta. Thank you. Yeah, come in here.
Abhi, are you ready?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much. So this slide, which will be shared with you, lists some of the accomplishments and publications from this project, but let's review on that. Here's the team right here. So I'm Auroop. You already heard from Robin. I'm Auroop. This is Sam. This is Marta. Ben is virtual. Satish is driving. Hopefully he'll be able to join at 10 a.m. But we had a short thing for him, which I think if needed, Sam can fill up for him. So we have folks from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Naval Research Lab, Pacific Northwest National Lab, UC Berkeley, and Northeastern. So again, academia, government, and national labs are well represented. Okay, so the first thing I'll talk about is about this integrated NICE vision. So what we have here on the, if you look at the top left, that's the blue quadrant. That's our, what we are calling a generalizable approach for dealing with resilience of an installation. What we mean by resilience of an installation? The interconnected systems, subsystems, components that comprise the installation itself, as much as we have visibility to, or what we can get visibility to, etc., including not just the systems, subsystems, but also their interdependencies. But also, as I was saying earlier, no installation is an island. So whether it's a DoD installation or whether it's an airport, it depends on the infrastructure and the people that's outside that installation, and they may have different chains of command or ways of responding. In some cases, no chain of command. In some cases, some objective function. So if we are thinking of, for example, an installation, it has to function with the power grid, which is usually outside of their control. They may have some power inside, but it also depends on power grids outside, communication systems outside, water distribution systems, and of course, transit systems and transportation in general. So the approach that we have there is what we are calling MSD, multiplex network science, multi-scale system dynamics. Basically, looking at the topology of the network, how things interconnect with each other, what are those entities, so the basics of that network, and what flow patterns, what dynamics happens on top of the network. And one decision that we made here, with, in addition to all the papers and such, is to produce something that's tangible, which can be used. So we took the route here of building a patent. I'll come to that in a minute. But then bottom left, that's where we have compound threats. What we mean by compound threats, that from the U.S. Army Corps perspective, for example, and Ben will talk about that, and the Naval Research Lab is also part of that, is how do we define compound threats that are of relevance. And what have we seen? So whether it's weather extremes, climate extremes, that's one of the focus here. This is strategic environmental R&D program. But also there could be other kinds of, let's say, policy shocks, resource constraints, pandemics, and technological failures, etc., which could also have, which fall under this purview of compound threats. So what are those threats? How do we manage this? Then we go to the bottom right, that's in red. That's advancing the theory of these networks, both in terms of the network topology and the dynamics, and looking at a large scale system, specifically the San Francisco fuel network. So we will look initially at some other systems such as rail transit systems, but here Marta is leading the team that is looking at San Francisco fuel network. So that's Professor Marta Gonzalez from UC Berkeley. And then we go back to a zoomed in version, but this time going to a simulated but realistic DoD installation. How can that look like? And that will be led by Sam Chatterjee at PNNL. So with that, so here is the team that I will talk about. I mean, this is as I was at a national lab earlier, and in the private industry. One thing though, as a faculty, there's nothing that we really do without our students and postdocs. So I want to acknowledge some members of the team. The others are here. So this is from a visit through a NASA project to the TVA, where Pooja, August, and Ashish and others from the TVA were looking at weather extremes. That's in the middle. On the right, that's Jack getting a prize at the Society for Risk Analysis for his work, etc. So these are very blessed and fortunate to have this kind of students and postdocs. Broadly speaking, here is where we are with the project itself. So this was presented during the SERDP IPR, the in-progress review report. So it's a slightly dated by now, but more or less there. You'll also find this same thing more or less represented in that poster in case you have time during lunch, etc. So the idea is task 1 is to build the approach, and there are various subtasks within that. Task 2 is to build hypotheses and models and scenarios for evaluation of the approach. And task 3 is to demonstrate in the context of DoD and especially DoD installations. And we have some guests here, Todd Hay from PNNL and Shubhra Mishra. So they work very closely with the defense adaptation, climate adaptation toolkit and other aspects of installation resilience. So we'll hear from them and many others. Now, while these are different, task 1, task 2, task 3, they do need to feed to each other. We cannot build a system where we don't have connections with stakeholders. So there is a strong iterative feedback here. We got this project in 2020 during COVID, so there was some delay. Officially started in 2021. This is a 5-year project, so this is about half of where we are. I mean, midway. Now here is the invention disclosure. So this is called, it's a mouthful, Multiplex Network Science and Multi-Scale System Dynamics, an approach to assessing the resilience of interdependent installations and infrastructure environments under compound extreme disruption. So compound extreme is what I just said, all kinds of extreme. But what we mean by that is what is shown on the top right here, which is here's the installation. Here are all the systems and infrastructures that support that installation. It could be surrounding the installation or supporting. There was an interesting article by the Union of Concerned Scientists about naval submarine base Kings Bay, where they said something like, no installation is an island. So using that similar kind of thing. So there are interdependencies both within and without, and trying to consider both of those. We filed a provisional patent through Northeastern. If I can ask you to stand up if you have contributed to this patent, please. I'd really like to acknowledge you. So the lead inventor is Jack Watson. If any of you have questions, please stay standing just for a while, Jack. Just for a while. Ashish Pal, thank you. And Sam, please. And Marta. And Ariel is not here. So Ariel works with.
He's online.
He's online. So Please take your seats. Thank you so much. And again, if you want to talk with anybody, you can, of course, but so Jack will be happy to take you through some of these things. Incredibly proud of what they have achieved here. One other thing that we have been doing is looking at some specific networked infrastructure, if you call it that, and where we have data and where we have some information. It's relatively easier to get information about transportation networks. So what we have been doing is looking at both the city of Boston's MBTA, 9 infrastructure urban rail networks, both within the US and outside, DC, Boston, Chicago, Delhi, Tokyo, Paris, Shanghai, London, New York. As of now, we are expanding that a little bit. And an interesting thing where you're looking at the entire Northeast megalopolis, as it's said, some people call it Boswash Corridor. It includes Maine, it includes other areas. So this would be the 3rd highest GDP country if it were a country, behind the rest of the US and China. That's how big it is. And also in terms of population and everything. And there has been a lot of money that has been spent right now. There's a lot of budget in terms of intercity communications and so on. So it's a multi-scale rail network. There are urban metro systems, there are commuter rails, and there are these intercity links. And these are coastal and urban, so the dangers of flooding. This is still work in progress. But again, this one Jack has been leading, the other one Ashish has been leading, so you can talk to either of them. In addition to the core science that we are trying to deal with, science and engineering and the problem, I'd like to emphasize that there are side benefits, there are implications for the science. So what our program manager once asked me that, could you explain this, whatever this network thing you're doing and recovery from an ecological perspective? And that will help in many ways, including for the technical committee and so on. I said, first of all, I forwarded them Jiangshi's paper in Nature, the Mother Nature, the Nature. And there are so many natures out there. And then I said, wait a little bit, and we may have something. So this is by one of my former students and a colleague in ecology right here, ecological networks. So this is recovery in ecological networks, mutualistic networks, plant pollinator networks. Again, this is not exactly the same. Methods are not exactly the same. The adaptation is significant, but very broadly, conceptually, it's still networks which helps you restore. I'm very proud, again, of my students and postdocs, many of whom are here, not all of whom are here, but 9 of us from our SDS lab, Sustainability and Data Sciences Laboratory here. We went to, last year, we went to the United Nations headquarters to talk about sustainable infrastructure and to talk about climate and weather extremes. Many of us gave talks. I would like to point to 2 of them whose presentations were highlighted. If you could please stand up, Pooja and Rachindra. Thank you so much. So their presentations to the United Nations, it was a team with across different nations, different countries. And Dia, I was just looking for you. Please stand up also. And so Dia is from Indonesia, Pooja is from Bangladesh, Rachindra is from Sri Lanka originally. And they talked about what can be done with all the things we do here in those respective countries. It was very well received. And this was an multi-nation team. So thank you so much. Please take your seat. And and then we each year we go to many different parts of the world. Well, one part of the world each year to study what I call climate change in emerging economies. That's a study abroad program. This time I'll leave on May 4th to go to Thailand and Indonesia. And we have very interesting, things that emerge there. So I've already talked about the integrated NICE vision. Again, the first part in blue, top left, the approach, the basics of the approach. Bottom, that's in green. Then we'll go next. That's compound threat management needs for DoD from the perspective of US Army Corps and Naval Research Lab. Bottom right in red, that's a large real network, the San Francisco real network, and looking at both system dynamics and network topology. And then on the top right in gray, focused, realistic, but simulated studies with DoD installations. With that, let me hand over to Ben. Ben is online. Ben, do you want me to control the slides?
Yes, please. That'd be helpful. So as I'm getting started, so I owe significant gratitude to my partners at SERDP, and I believe Igor is there. I think I heard him. I didn't see him, but his voice is unmistakable. And also to Himanshu Das at USACE, who's been invaluable and a good friend throughout this process. So what I'm going to talk about today is an effort to try and derive a scientific, quantifiable approach to evaluate compounding threats. There's a lot of moving parts here. I'm only going to go through the tops of the waves, and I believe that Igor in his presentation later at 10 will go over a bit more. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So a couple of years ago, in beginning this process, we were trying to unpack, what does a compounding threat mean? There are many different perspectives and policies out there that reference compounding threats. There's some academic papers that describe them descriptively. But in terms of trying to strive for something that can be proven quantitatively, objectively, methodologically, that still remains a significant gap in public-facing literature. So we have a team, former PhD student, then postdoc with us that published in Progress in Disaster Science that got together many leading perspectives from global scholars related to infrastructure, complex infrastructure resilience. And from there, we see compounding threats as threats that co-occur in time and space. But importantly, the consequences, unless the initial disaster is completely destructive, like 90 to 100% destruction, you're going to see multiplicative rather than additive effect, multiplicative rather than additive consequence to the affected interconnected systems in their population. Next slide. So using this definition, our work over the past couple of years is attempting to go forward and figure out how we can prove that, or at least begin to acquire data and develop some modeling capabilities that are useful both from not just from a scientific perspective, but equally from to assist decision making and command and control related issues for installation managers and commanders that are confronted by these two or more events that co-occur in time and space, that is often going to rattle the way that traditional decision making is done, right? If you have two co-occurring crises, even if one is slightly abating, you have different teams that are oriented to address those specific issues, but when they experience substantial losses in their capabilities and operating functions due to other disruption, it's going to limit the ability to promote recovery, both from a bottom-up governance perspective and from a top-down as well. So again, we're looking for that multiplicative effect and trying to identify ways where a facility might be able to understand their exposure, both historically and modeling into the future of where we're likely to go, with the hope that we can further identify intervention points to move our recovery curve to be much, much faster, cheaper, and less labor intensive. Next slide, please. So the way that we're doing that is to basically acquire as much data as possible. There have been a number of different sources that we've turned to, but ultimately we're looking for codings of different hazards as granular as possible. So at a county or census tract level, coded for hazard, coded for consequence, and from there try to derive different exposure characteristics. Next slide, please. So a critical note of why this is important and why there is a gap in current public-facing capabilities. There have been a lot of tools released recently, tools, heads-up displays, things like that, that have attempted to evaluate and visualize risk and resilience. They're very helpful. It is a substantial improvement to the field. But for compounding threats, they are not sufficient. There's limited data tracking, and internally, there are significant issues related to understanding ties or dependencies within and between different events. Part of that issue is many of these tools were not intended to perform that function. But secondly is from a definitional, methodological, mathematical perspective, trying to figure out which two events are overlapping and co-occur versus which do not is not necessarily trivial. So we had to create some boundary conditions when we're looking at environmental threats. And for the rest of this presentation, I will show you our initial work on environmental compounding threats with the hope that we, going forward, this can be a baseline to add in additional concerns such as social and cyber exposure to social and cybersecurity threats. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do is what you're going to see is output from about the past 22 years. We're also looking at future forecast capabilities. And ultimately, this is done at a census tract or county level. But this methodology and different permutations of this have been applied in companion projects in different places in the Middle East, like Iraq and incoming into Libya and Turkmenistan. So within this, we are trying to understand, again, lowest level to the ground, what are the different environmental threats that we have? What has been the experience of them, the relative frequency, and the effects that we've experienced, and to derive some trends from there. And then co-locate pieces of key critical infrastructure on top of that, which for the case of the NICE project is military installations. Next slide, please. So for looking for the case of California, this result is also in tandem with a companion project that Igor will be able to speak more to. We're looking at, again, county level, California as a case study, because the data that you're looking at, if you look at all counties in the United States, is potentially millions and millions of data points. And we're trying to get some small cases to get going at first. So again, we're looking to see the co-location of military infrastructure on top of counties that are of high exposure to different environmental threats like earthquakes or floods or wildfires, landslides, and others. Of course, when you go across the country, there's going to be different categories of threat that are more frequent than others, and we do account for that. Over. Next slide. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is use this capability from a methodological base to enable a national mapping of compounding threat exposure, frequency, and effect against our installations. And from this, we have to look at each individual set of compounding threats. Again, this is of course more automated, but I wanted to show you the distinction of a problem that's many data scientists have when they're engaging in compounding threats is you're looking for some correlative effect, either positive or inverse relationship. That is not as trivial as it sounds, and of course you're looking for causal order. And what we generally, for example, on the left, there is not necessarily an observable relationship between wildfire deaths and a wind speed event, but when you see in the case of floods and wildfires, we have identified, particularly for Kern County in California, that the extreme number of wildfires prior to flooding results in more extreme flooding in Kern County, which there are a number of environmental causes of that. Next slide, please. So once we identify exposure and get some effect, we also want to try and commodify that in terms of dollars. This is going to allow us to, in the future, understand what is the cost benefit of different interventions. So when you're looking at compounding versus non-compounding threats, according to the current data tools that we're working with, we found that there's a 43% chance that damage is greater than $1 million if flood is preceded by wildfire. Again, going back to the case of the previous slide, but only a 10% chance that the damage is greater than 1 million if the flood is not preceded by wildfire. Controlling for county. So when you're looking at this, we can clearly see that there is a substantial increase in potential effect. From there, we need to be looking at different exposure trends. Next slide. So we're beginning to look at that. This is definitely a work in progress, and it's going to take us through much of next year, but again, so just from drawing a correlation heat map, again, looking at those two comparison graphs that I showed you, this is a range of different environmental stressors and categories that we saw, looking at how frequently they co-occur relative to our compounding threat definition. Next slide. So just to wrap up, there's a lot that we need to do, but ultimately we're trying to answer a few questions. Where and when do compounding threats happen? How much worse are these events in tandem rather than in isolation as single events? And what does this mean for military commanders and installation managers as they are trying to navigate this new space. Like as we're looking forward towards climate risk, should we expect to be seeing through forecasting that many of these compounding risks are going to increase? Are the effects going to be worse? So ultimately, what this tool does or is intended to do when it is finished is to provide an initial exposure assessment. Which installations are exposed to different types of compounding threats and at what frequency, and is that frequency going to become worse into the future, as well as the expected potential loss and implications for mission execution. So with that, I will turn it over back to the team and introduce Dr. Marta Gonzalez. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So the task the Berkeley team had was to develop a theoretical framework to study the resilience. And for that, we apply multiplex network science and multi-scale dynamics. My team is AAA, Auroop, Abdullah, Ariel, and Aparimit. So I apologize I didn't bring their pictures. So we are motivated by disasters that are more frequent under climate change. Disasters can be landslides, fires, and flooding. And we want to see how this disaster affects complex multiplex networks, for example, supply chains and fuel transportation. And what we do is we go from the complex dynamics and complex network to effective network, and we study there the stability to supply the demand and how long the disruption would be to affect the performance of the network. So the case study in which we are going to test our framework is the fuel transportation network in the Bay Area. And it is important to notice that we pay detailed attention to the environmental effects. To that end, we work with 4 circulation models, 2 representative circulatory pathways, 3 sea level rise percentiles, and we estimate the damage in 4 time horizons. Our network is a multiplex network. It has the refineries, the terminal, and the gas stations, and how the fuel is affected, the fuel transportation is affected when roads and pipelines are destroyed. Then the first step we do is to normalize all the equations, all the variables, and the variables are the productions, the demand, and we have the capacities in the typical refineries, terminals, and the important result is what is the stock level in the gas station. That is our end result. And we have the detailed network and their interconnections, and we write down the effective equations in a normalized fashion. And we do the flow equations for that end. Then here are the results. As a further step, as the time horizons go, we see here in the first plot in the left-hand side how the network's properties in percentage from the original network we have are disrupted. And we see already in the conservative scenario, already in the 4th time horizon, the network is disrupted. In the more higher emission scenarios, the disruptions come earlier. And we are able to see, as a function of the effective network properties in the middle plot, we see what percentage of the demand is fulfilled in the gas stations. And we see already in the 3rd and 4th horizons, we're going to have problems. We feel more than 50% of the gas in the gas station. We see that even if we have several scenarios, what is the percentage of cases in which the demand can be fulfilled at a given level? And as we see, it's going to be worse in the future in the less conservative scenario that is RCP 8.5. A very interesting exercise we can do with these approaches is that we can test interruptions of the production from half week to 5 weeks, and we see how the stock level changes. And we have cases like this one in which we don't have fuel in the gas station. And we are going to be seeing if we have more resources to begin with, what is the time of failure in weeks? Even in the most conservative scenarios, we can go from 2 weeks to 1 week. due to these flooding events. Then, what I show you is how you go from a complex system to the dimension reduction version of it. It was inspired by Jan Shigao's work in nature, and this approach can be applied to any resource flow in the network. And the consumption points can be installations of DoD, and this paper was accepted last week in collaboration with Northeastern in communication physics. Notice that the approach to reduce the complexity of the system is very powerful. However, we have one question is, how realistic the effective network is? And the idea is if it's realistic, we can apply it to many other studies. Then, to answer that question, to test the dimension reduction approach in a system we know the details, we are analyzing now the same methodology in a mobility network, which is a network we know all the details. We know the traffic simulation, we have mobility data. And then what we're going to be seeing is the effective dynamic of the system. In the y-axis, we have the fraction of congested links over time and how that effective dynamic is generated by the other areas. So we go from the street to zones and how the congestion is spread between one zone to another zone. And the idea is if we test the methodology, we can have localized areas that we want to protect that are in the installation in the type of disasters that Ben was talking about. Then, what is the dynamic of traffic that can be effective? Nicely, it has been shown that congestion can be modeled with an infection-like dynamic. So you have the fraction of congested node increases versus when the congestion comes to your neighboring zones, and then every zone have an effective beta and effective mu. So we're testing this model. This is work in progress. And basically what we're going to be doing is calibration the multi-scale dynamics. Then we're going to move into maximizing resilience in localized installation. And we're going to see how effective the effective dynamic describe the details of the system. And with that, I'm gonna pass to my colleague Sam that he's gonna work on localized installations.
Thank you, Marta. Hi, everyone. Sam Chatterjee, and in the next few minutes, I'll just walk you through some work that we have initiated, a little bit more sort of zoomed in focus. So looking at a specific simulated installation setting and how MNS MSD concept, how can we instantiate that or, within a sort of focused region. And want to acknowledge the contributions from the PNL team. We have a large team over the years, and they've made some strong contributions as we've made progress. So wanted to start first with the context behind this particular MNS MSD instantiation. So the function that we wanted to sort of focus on, which sort of helps tie within installation activities with the surrounding urban area, was mobility as an initial function, because that also resonated well with our program manager, where if you start to think in terms of how mobility, both activities within the installation and movement within, as well as the surrounding area, how that function can potentially support multiple installation missions. And if we use the urban area road networks, where we're likely to have more granular data available to model mobility on the outside. And there's an illustration here from a representative installation and then a surrounding network around, surrounding urban area road network around it. We can use that understanding in terms of mobility and impacts to mobility as a result of a wide area disruption, how that would then affect activities within an installation, where in this case we are leveraging a suite of system dynamics models to capture dynamics and activities within. Then the key here is then to be able to understand the touch points from the outside, which is a more granular microscopic simulation model, and the inside, which is a more higher level coarser system dynamics model, and how we can share parameters within those models and try to capture effects that may originate outside, wide area effects, but at the same time, also disturbances that may be localized and target activities within. So how can we capture both the compounding, the wide area and the localized disruptions, as well as impacts from a mobility standpoint on the outside as well as the inside? So that's kind of the setup. And before I sort of show how we are approaching this modeling simulation exercise, wanted to kind of provide a little bit more context with a notional scenario timeline. This seems to help in terms of understanding how we are piecing together all the different modeling simulation components. And from left to right, essentially, I'll just maybe walk you through, might be evident. So we have a series of events at the top and a series of impacts at the bottom. And essentially, the first event that we label here, T sub 1, is a wide area extreme event, which impacts the external or surrounding urban area road network. And an impact in terms of that particular event is at some point in time, we start to observe that customer arrival rates at their various service facilities within the installation. So because there is disruption outside, that may start to have an effect in terms of arrival rates of customers at a service facility, which may be because of folks trying to receive relief or trying to get shelter. And then at T sub 2, there is a more widespread effect in the urban road network where there are lane closures. So now certain parts of the network outside are not usable anymore. So the mobility function outside is disrupted significantly. And as a result of that, in the next time point here, we're referring to a storage facility within the installation where now commodity restocking is delayed because now there is a much greater traffic disruption that's undergoing. And then T sub 3, next event occurs where now things are already starting to look not optimal, but there is a localized power facility that now gets disrupted. So now this is where we are referring to the localized event, which is sort of occurring while a wide area event is already ongoing. So now as a result of the power disruption at the power facility, now we start to experience power outage because the storage and service facilities depend on power. So there's an outage at the storage service facilities. Now the storage facility, which we are modeling here as one which stores critical commodities, it needs to be maintained at certain critical ambient temperatures. Now the temperature of the facility starts to increase because there is no power. You're not able to maintain commodities at desired conditions. And as a result of that, the facility temperature increases, refrigeration unit temperatures start to increase, and customers' service facility, their demands are also starting to now get unmet. And as a result of that, there is sort of degradation in terms of performance at service and storage facilities, which then eventually there is at a time point later further right where the power supply crew is able to come in and restore power. So now we start to see again at T sub 4, power is back, and now things start to stabilize again at storage service, and the demands are now starting to get met. So this is sort of a notional timeline which we are through modeling and simulation, we want to be able to capture various aspects of which leverage network and system-based methods. And again, this is just a sort of an illustration of the timeline that I showed in the previous slide, where on the left, we have sort of the outside urban area or road network model, which is based on a micro simulation model. So it's a detailed agent-based model of traffic mobility. There are various touch points that you'll see from that outside model, which is the one that experiences the wide area event, to various facilities. There are 3 categories of generic facilities that we have defined within the installation boundary here. One we call a storage facility, which is comprised of heat transfer, commodity degradation models. There's a suite of models inside of that block. Then there's a service facility where we are using queuing theory based models to model customer and service interactions. And then on the far right, we have a power facility, which is a combined heat and power flow model, where for the underlying models for each of these facilities, we're using state-of-the-art open source information. In some cases, we have DOE prototype building simulation models that we are able to leverage to capture activities within these different types of facilities. And I also note here various data capture nodes where, again, information, everything that we present here is using open source information and data, as well as proxy information. So those are kind of key touch points where we're capturing network and system-based data and feeding the different modeling blocks. And then this is my last slide. So just wanted to leave you with, so where does all this modeling simulation, what does that get us to? Or what's the big takeaway from it? So essentially, what I wanted to present here was, so you see this sort of panel with mobility impacts, and there's a sequence of performance plots or functionality plots over time. So that collectively is the way we are capturing the mobility impacts within the installation. And these represent different data junctions across the modeling simulation ecosystem, from commodity arrivals to customer flows to temperature in storage units to power facility outputs. So that collectively is sort of giving us a sense for, well, how resilient is the system, or can we capture different aspects of the system and its function over time to collectively then provide us some insights around. Now, if we were to look at different types of missions may rely on a combination of these different functionality plots. And that's where we're working closely with our Naval Research Lab partners, as well as Lieutenant Colonel Craig Poland from the US Air Force, to now translate this mobility impacts through performance curves into mission impacts over time. And just so showing here sort of an illustration of a couple of different types of missions, which may have very different profiles in terms of how critical events take place and how we kind of translate the logic from the functionality-based impacts, which is coming from modeling simulation, into mission terms. There's still more work to be done in terms of more closely integrating modeling simulation parameters from the outside the fence as well as inside the fence mod sim elements. And also then extracting resilience metrics from these series of performance curves. So we're not just referring now to one resilience function, but now we have a collection of performance curves. So we'll have a suite of resilience related metrics to sort of extract those and then use them to translate into mission impact terms. That's kind of the next steps here. So with that, I will hand it over to Auroop again to take us home.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thanks, Marta. Thanks, Ben. I would request all of you, Sam and Marta are here. Ben, if you could please make yourselves visible. Craig, if you're here also, if you please make yourself visible. I know you have some emergencies to attend, so I don't know if you can, but you are here. Hey, Craig, how are you? Oh, Ariel, if you can also make your. Yes, so we want to open up this session for Q&A. Before I do, just wanted, so you heard from Ben. I believe Sam just mentioned about Craig. Craig is in the US Air Force. Among our alumni about whom we are very proud. Craig, would you want to say just a couple of sentences about yourself, and then we can open up and I'll just tie this whole thing up and open it up. Craig.
Absolutely, great, thank you. So Northeastern alum, I'm currently at the Civil Engineer School at the Air Force Institute of Technology. I've been in the Air Force about 16 years as a civil engineer officer, currently doing continuing education and working with the graduate school at the Air Force Institute of Technology, teaching civil engineers about resilience and then operations at DoD installations worldwide. So happy to be here and provide some perspective and look forward to the conversation. Wish I could be there in person. Good to see you all.
Thank you so much, Craig, and always a pleasure and a privilege to have students like these. So just before I open up for Q&A, again, what we talked about is top left in blue, that's the method or the approach. Network science, topology, and dynamics leading to papers and such, also a provisional pattern. Bottom left is in green. That's what was presented by Ben, compound threat management for DoD from the perspective of the Army Corps. Bottom right, that's the advanced in theory as well as adaptation to a very large real network, the San Francisco Fuel Network, that was presented by Marta. Right, top right, that's now the focused down version of those, but on an installation, what does it mean for an installation and its surrounding ecosystem with a specific example, realistic simulation. We'd very much, first of all, like to have any questions you may have and then start to see what is next for us. Where would you suggest we go? How best can we integrate with you?
We can start with Dr. Mister because I know
Yes.
he already has questions.
Absolutely, please.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel and all the presentations. To be clear that, so I'm from DoD, but anything I say, don't take that as direction. That's got to come from Kevin or somebody else in the credit PM. Of course. So that's clear. Maybe start with the last one from Sam's. The new word I learned, instantiate. I have not heard that before. And this is an overarching comment. It's all really cool stuff and fascinating, but the relevance to DoD and the DoD perspective is a little bit missing, I think, at least at this point, right? I know you guys are heading towards that, right? So like, for example, when you talk about mobility, right? I mean, maybe think about things like defense access roads, right? I mean, it's not just DoD installations are very different than civilian neighborhoods, right? Or, general neighborhoods and the connectivities that are there. I'm reading this report to Congress from 2019 on the defense access roads. It basically says that the military department have indicated that they do not currently have any flood-prone locations creating a national security risk to transportation access for military installation. I don't know, is there, so just make it maybe relevant, right? Couple of comments on Marta's presentation. You're looking at, again, related to flooding, right? I mean, again, this is a framework, but if you're using sea level rise, I mean, DoD is mandated to use the DoD regional sea level database scenarios. So it's not just, RCP 4.5 and 8.5, but there are very specific things that are in our policy and in our USCs that everyone across DoD has to use, right? We can't use different numbers. I guess the question was, so, I mean, you talk about sea level rise. How does that really impact the fuel supply chain? Are you talking about like storm surge flooding, or is this common like sunny day flooding because of sea level rise itself that's impacting the fuel supply chain? How is that?
Actually, what we were able to have for this particular project is a private data on the pipelines. And depending where the pipelines are, they would get flood, and that we assume it would affect the actual fuel distribution. In fact, this came as a follow-up work with the California Energy Commission, in which we have the oil companies with us, and they accepted this type of approaches. And the other is when we have flooding, and then the trucks cannot supply the level of service. So it was flooding through the pipelines and the road networks.
Right. So, I mean, I used to work at an oil and gas company. I mean, I don't understand the pipeline part of it because particularly just sea level rise. Sure, that would impact.
Yeah, it's going to be flooded, and then it's going to be disrupted. Is the stability of the pipelines.
So I guess if I may just interject a little bit, are you asking about, is it the inundation from sea level rise? Is it because of sea level rise? There could be, coastal storm surge, or is it a combination of both? Is that getting towards?
Yeah, because I mean, DoD gets fuel in a variety of ways, right? There could be direct pipeline, there could be transport, right? So
Yes.
which one of those is impacted by sea level rise? I don't think.
Pipelines and road transportation network. Also, both of them, and we were in that particular project. We were working on the transportation towards the public gas stations. We use data from all the gas stations in the Bay Area.
Right, okay.
One point here, Satish, are you in a position where you can make yourself visible? If yes, please do so. If not, it's okay. I mean, Satish was stuck in traffic. Just wanted to introduce him. He is from the Naval Research.
Yeah, I'm still not in a stable situation, but I'm available for audio.
It's okay, Satish. When you can, you'll join and we can interact with you. It's okay.
Sure, sure. Thank you.
Just just wanted to say one thing. Your point, Shubhra, is very well taken. In the sense that a lot of these things we are doing, we are saying, okay, it's applicable broadly, right? Even the patent, if you call the provisional patent, I shouldn't say patent yet. So, we are saying that it's applicable to, for example, supply chains, business supply chains, warehouses in private sector, airports, seaports, right? I mean, anything, and DoD installations. What that means is, okay, it could be broadly applicable. What it also means is we have not focused as much as we should on DoD installations eventually. And the same here in terms of examining hypotheses and scenarios, which Marta and Sam was talking about. That is precisely our task 3. That doesn't mean we haven't done anything. I mean, we have people like, Craig and Satish and others who have been helping us, but we need a lot more work there and a lot more help there. So your questions are on point. I'd love help from all of you, including, of course, Todd, who is here from PNL, who is working on DCAT. So, but your questions are very much on point, completely.
Yeah, but the point is for this to be useful to DoD, right? I mean, if you just end up writing a report, I mean, this is not an NSF funded project, right?
Absolutely.
And for you to be proud of the work you're doing and that DoD is going to use in some tool or application or policy or something, I mean, it's a big deal for us. I mean, supply chain disruptions, all that, right? So
almost it's like, theory, the proof of concept with real, with simulated, getting on to, okay, now let's get real, where the rubber hits the road, as they say. So that's the approach. So yes, we are at a stage where, so for example, to get your papers in communication physics of nature and so on and so forth, you need broad range of scenarios. And it helps us that, okay, it's applicable to broad range of scenarios. But it's also important to focus on theory. So, as I was saying, I mean, your points are very well taken, and partly hence this workshop. Yeah.
Yeah, so Shubhra's point is very kind of timely. I mean, what is the use of this theory and also approach, right? So it's tough, as the concept is maturing. So, for example, I've been working with Ben and also the Satish, trying to understand the optimizations concepts, right? For example, you ultimately, let's say, I'm a storm surge guy, so I'm just talking about the flooding, and then different assets are there, right? So how do you optimize the during an event? How do you optimize those things? So those are kind of still in a theory level, but it's kind of getting there to be real useful there, but it takes a little bit of time there.
Absolutely. So completely agree with you on that.
yeah, and when you get to that blue box, right? I mean, there are plenty of case studies for DoD installations that have across the board all these challenges, right? It should be fairly easy to pick one or two where you can apply this and the real world historical thing that has happened.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, absolutely. That's a very good point.
I have a couple of comments for Ben, if you don't mind. Sorry.
Ben, these are coming for you. Go ahead, please.
No, just
Fire away.
comments for yourself. So, I mean, you, in one of your slides, you have exposure and vulnerability separately, right? I mean, and as Todd knows, because he's managing it, we are calling vulnerability to incorporate exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Vulnerability, so those are not separate things. One is within the other, so to speak, right?
Yes, understood.
And then I think you also had a phrase, environmental threats. I would suggest moving away from that, maybe calling it natural hazards or something. Environmental threats has a very specific connotation, which is very sensitive within DoDs, like PFAS and all these other things. I don't think we want to get there, which is not where you go.
Yeah. Point well taken. We'll make that change.
And you mentioned the compound, like the typology of compound threats as specifically something which is current in space and time. That is the most acute, but there are spatial and temporal, like non-concurrent events and impacts that happen, which also pose extreme burdens on DoD. These are like, think of events that are happening, say, in the southeast, like Dorian, for example, right? It passed through southeast all the way to the northeast, right? And different times, different geographies, right? Which also stretched, like National Guardsmen being deployed in Puerto Rico and then in Florida, right? I mean, these are geographically disparate, and that happens in time as well. So it's not just a concurrent compounding threats. It might be the most acute, I'm not sure, but it might not be.
Yeah, no, I definitely point well taken. So because I only had 10 minutes, I didn't get into some of the criteria that we had for justifying what to include and exclude as a compounding threat based on historical record. And we do take into account threats that materialize over a very broad space, like again, multi-county events. Because if we're seeing things that are exclusively within a very small area, if it's co-located with a military installation, of course we care, right? And we still account for that. But there is from waiting for effects, right, consequences. Looking at things that span broad swaths of the country that may include multiple installations are of course of interest. And this is like the challenge that we've got is like this is not a finished product. So that's what in terms of the way we represent that, I haven't solved that one yet. So I would love any ideas that you could offer over.
Yeah, that's exactly the point, right? Because if you only look at an installation or a community or a municipality, that's very local. So you only have to worry about what is happening there, right? But DoD, and that's the challenge with DoD, anything to do with DoD is so big, right? It's so global. Like, I mean, we worry about at the DoD, OSD level, things that are happening across the country, right? And the world, right? I mean, that's what strains our readiness, not just what's happening at one installation. So, a couple of last two quick comments on wildfire. One of your slides showed that there's no correlation between wildfire deaths and wind speeds. That may be true, but there's significant correlation, as I imagine between wildfires and wind speeds. I mean, there's the 10% rule and the 15% rule on frontal fire spreading with wind speeds. So the deaths may not be correlated. And the question then is that the right metric to pick? Deaths versus the occurrence or the extent of wildfires, and how that is very highly correlated with wind speeds. I mean, this is something we're actively looking into right now because of future projections of wind speed and how wildfires may spread. So just to comment on that, and you also talk about wildfire and flooding, right? In terms of wildfires preceding flooding and how that exacerbates it. It's not necessarily the wildfire; it's the land degradation that happens because of wildfire that causes runoff and flooding, right? So
no, of course, and again, it's from a compounding threat perspective, the damage is not it is not the hazard characterization that is causing all of this. It is the effects that are arising from them. And we're not trying to infer that's one immediately on top of another. It creates a result. But in other projects that we're looking into, again, looking at degree of wildfire spread, the square footage that is covered, the amount of time and damage that is taken. And then if you were to co-occur with something like an atmospheric river, right, which is a big problem in the West and Southwest. So yeah, I completely agree with where you're coming from. Absolutely.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? You can always, yes, Dave. Yes, go ahead, Dave, first and then.
Sure. Hi, everyone. You'll hear from me this afternoon. So I have a question probably for each of the speakers, but I'll start with Ben. He's on. Hi, Ben. So this notion of a compound threat, which comes from a compound event, sort of a comment and a two-part and a question, right? So you talked about wanting to understand where and when they occur, how much worse are they going to be, and what does it mean for an installation commander?
Correct.
The notion of a compound threat sort of follows from the presumption that there are single events or single threats, which I don't think are actually true. I think the notion of a single root cause kind of a thing is kind of a fallacy, and that all kind of major events are compound events in some way because you have a breakdown in multiple kind of ways.
Sure.
So I guess, so if that's the case, then with this notion of compound threat or compound event, like what are the kinds of questions you think the installation commanding officer might be, like how would it change their thinking in terms of what they might do as you start to frame this set of problems? Over.
Right. So the goal of this part of our work is to provide some objective boundaries that would allow someone to make a decision in a relatively short time period when facing an awful lot of pressure to do so, political, social, etc. Now, ultimately, again, all of us in this room are prisoners to the data that we have, or the data that we're able to derive. So in this case, in terms of classifying events, we're looking at things related to environmental record, as well as, and most usefully, emergency declarations at a local or state or federal level. So in this case, like, I'm a complex systems guy. I completely hear you when you're saying that, you know, threats are never as simple as we describe them to be. But from a command and control and response perspective, from what DoD can do about that, there are, again, my opinion and no one else's, explicit options that are prepared for ahead of time. We're trying to provide at least some visualization to show where have our installations come from relative to exposure to compounding threats of a natural origin. I'm gonna use that jargon. I'll figure that one out. Number one, but number two is, given the uncertainty of where we're going to go, what are the additional things beyond normal that some of our installations might need to be preparing for? So across all of this is, we can't delve too far into everything in the science. I want to give them as much as I can, but separately, would love to talk to you more about how we can take this outside of, again, a visualization exercise for DoD into unpacking more objective quantitative theory of compounding threats. Would love to talk offline. Over.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I like to answer this question. Oh, sorry. I like to answer this question from other perspective. I would argue that all we do now is based on single risk scenario. We try to find the spectacular scenario of climate change or military disruption, and we try to prioritize how a component of the system are vulnerable and act on the highest risk. What in reality happening is that, you know, two small risks or threat can collapse you equally well, like Silicon Valley Bank collapses. You know, as clear as it gets in my mind, you have really strong financial network, risk-averse policy. They shouldn't collapse under any risk assessment methodology that you would use, but Federal Reserve pushing them through interest rate and social contagion together collapse them. Right? So this is compounding threat in action. So translating it to military installation, I will give example of mold is actually like, you know, mold comes and goes, you know, we deal with that. But with climate change, you know, all of a sudden you may have a much bigger problem because you have systemic stress from climate change and, you know, normal fluctuation of humidity, HVAC misfunctioning, or lead ideas that actually result in more mold. And that's compounding, it results in a major problem, right? So I think that's kind of the way how we try to approach this with Ben. Hope it makes sense.
I was just gonna say, so we do a lot of wargaming, and these are coming more and more within the scope of wargaming. Like if we look at a hurricane in the Gulf Coast in a wargaming exercise, we look at all these disruption, right? These and additional compound hazards like rainfall, right? I mean, we're starting to look at it. So that's one place where this would be immediately relevant. And the other is the ACTA, the All Hazard Threat Assessment that DoD does, and those are all considered at this point individually. They're not connected at all. We don't look at compounding threats. The third is like the DER system, the defense readiness something reporting system. I mean, looking at the threats of multiple hazards concurrently or in quick succession and how that affects readiness. So there's ways that this could be very, very useful in existing DoD policies.
Yeah, but
And
there you
if
talk.
I can respond, so sir, one request I would have, I love that. That's what I love to hear, and if you could like help guide us towards some ways, like how visually you would like to see things, how can data be best represented for that would fit within these war games. We don't want to have to make like a big learning curve to get things in, but we also want to make sure that we're fitting into something that is in a existing or developing heads-up display. So whatever advice you can give us, we're at a point now where we can start directing how our output is going to look. Thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you're talking about scenario generation, then, which is maybe a little different from the vulnerability assessment. Like those things get coupled through the wargaming exercise. And so I agree, the scenario generation part really, really useful. But when things actually break down, they're never as simple as we might make them out to be. Oh, it was the one thing, right? So I guess my point is, and it's to Igor's point too, like when we're trying to understand when and how things fail, there's always multiple contributing things.
Agree, but you can't make a realistic scenario without knowing what those linkages are, right? Based on historical events and what has happened in the past.
But see, this is another point. Should we do the scenario analysis at all? If we move towards resilience, you can be threat agnostic. No matter what happens, you can find a way to recover. So that's another big push of this topic that we drafted in SERDP, like whatever, 8 years ago, is to really figure out a threat agnostic way to deal with these compounding threats, right?
I think joint staff would agree with you, but
Of course not. I mean, it's my job is to bring good new science, and maybe in 20 years they will agree. So.
Let's interrupt just for, I'll come back to you, Dave. Let's interrupt just in case she has to leave later. Oh, that's great. But still, I mean, just for introduction. So we have our Vice Provost of Global Impacts, Dr. Amy Carroll. Maybe if you'd like to come here and speak for a few minutes about the university setting. Sorry to interrupt. We'll come back to this.
I think I'm standing between you and coffee if I look at the agenda. So, but thank you for inviting me. So, as Auroop mentioned, I work in the Office of the Provost. I run a program called Impact Engines, which really embodies Northeastern's commitment to getting research and expertise in the real world and applying it to all these problems that you're talking about. And so I've been furiously taking notes and really enjoying this discussion about how could DoD use this in exactly the spirit of this project that you have going on. So I'm hoping I can stay for most of the day and learn from all of you. And we're very glad that you all could make your way to Boston, those of you who are visiting, to enjoy this exchange of ideas and again, focusing on that, getting the work out into the real world. So thanks.
Thanks, Amy.
For your coffee.
Thank you. And while we're at it, we have heard from multiple DoD sources, of course, including our SERDP program management, that they're very interested in this. They couldn't join in person because the IPR is going right now. Fortunate sequence of events that happened, which is, by the time we tried to change, they tried to change, it just didn't work out, which is fine. So they are very engaged. They've looked at our websites. They've sent us our comments. I mean, just make sure that it goes well. We'll try to make sure. Okay, why don't we go back to Dave? Meanwhile, I know that Amy already mentioned coffee, so please feel free to make this informal if you will. Have coffee, have water, have stuff. But while we continue the Q&A, Dave, over to you.
Okay, great. So I got a question for Marta and then I got a question for Sam. So for Marta, the dynamical systems model. So to what extent does that, and this is an issue I have with dynamical models in general, but to what extent does the dynamical systems model reflect the decisions being made by operators in terms of how they might adjust their behavior in response to various kinds of things, right? So you're kind of fixing a set of dynamics and then you're doing what if scenarios. That operators have the ability to change the behavior of the system potentially dramatically in response to some of the scenarios that you're looking at. So how does that then impact what you're able to say in a predictive sort of way?
Wonderful question. Yes, because that is one of my headaches. One thing that I told myself to feel better is that, as we know, in the United States, the investment in infrastructures take time. And road network infrastructure in general takes time. In this case, because it's affecting the business, maybe it's going to change. One of my department is urban planning, and I know how hard it is to change the structure of the city. So we didn't add that variable. One way we added is the production capacity and the level of stock. We put up to 30% and more when we did the scenario for the future. We didn't use the level of resources right now, but that was easy in the effective network dynamics. So we work with that. However, the actual network on the ground, we didn't change. But it's not that I didn't think about it. I just thought it was.
Yeah. So I mean, even,
Thank you.
so yeah, you have various actions on various timescales. Certainly changing road networks and whatnot, that takes a lot of time. But even within a pipeline network, right, you can open and close valves. You might be able to reconfigure or bring production on and off on much shorter timelines, and that could end up affecting.
Yes,
So,
we had those two avenues to do. Either go one into really improving resilience by local changes in the network, or testing the model in the urban context, and then we follow the second path. But I think that question you have is very much on point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
so that then kind of transitions to the question for Sam, which is a kind of a related question. In the model that you're simulating, like how much is trying to predict what will happen as opposed to assessing the capacity of the system to handle certain situations? Because those are very different kinds of things. And what do you feel like the model and simulation that you're building is ultimately trying to do?
So at the moment, great question, Dave. And I think we should chat some more about this throughout the day and later also. But at the moment, what we have is the latter. We're trying to understand, well, how capacities and again, we're making certain assumptions here, like just for example, with the service facility, right? We're assuming it's a MM1 queuing model. So there's a single server, there is Poisson rates, arrival, exponential service times. That assumption might be too strong for a realistic condition, especially when there are maybe some underlying disturbances going on. Maybe there's additional servers that can be made available if they are providing relief or service to customers trying to get certain commodities. So in terms of what may happen as a result of that, like how the system might stabilize or get back to some optimal level, we have to be able to, and the idea is for it to be composable, right? Where we can like swap out, let's drop this assumption here, let's introduce a new assumption, let's change. That's the spirit for the simulation, is at least for us to like have something somewhat easy to sort of pick and choose in terms of what do we want to, what conditions, what assumptions do we want to impose here, and now let's see what happens in terms of how well are we observing sort of these performances over time. That's the idea at the moment. So and hopefully next year, I mean, we're kind of working towards some kind of a lightweight demo, which allows for, maybe we can have certain knobs and sliders to where a user could perhaps change certain things around and see what might happen in terms of how performance sort of evolves. But I think the idea is then to be also make some connection to mission, and that's where I think working with Craig from Air Force and Satish from NRL, that's the step we're trying to kind of figure out, like how do we translate, what's the logic for the translating some of these performance deviations to mission related deviation. And that part, I think, I mean, talking to you earlier, Dan, too, I mean, there is lots of literature on mission mapping and mission indices, mission impact indices. I think we still need to like figure out what would be the a good sort of step in terms of helping with making some of those connections. And then to your point around can we then use that sort of computational pipeline to make predictions of what might happen or just stress test it and see, sort of understand the situational awareness, which in my mind eventually would inform a decision problem. We haven't gotten that far yet in terms of now if you have a set of resources and you have the ability to allocate those resources, how would you do it in an optimal sense? We haven't touched that problem yet. So it's still kind of more in terms of understand or getting better situational awareness and being able to more rapidly kind of break things and kind of swap things and see how we are able to capture the system's reactions.
Thank you, Sam. So Robin tells me that it's time for a break. We can continue these discussions, and I take Robin's words very seriously. So we can continue these discussions during the break, and but just wanted as a sneak preview of what is coming. Just wanted to mention we already introduced. You heard Craig introduce himself. Craig and Satish were relevant for this panel, so I asked them to introduce. They'll obviously be in other panel too. In the next panel, though, we'll introduce them at this panel, but just wanted to mention Ben will moderate the panel, and we'll have a very interesting session from industry and government. So again, very proud to announce that our alumna, Rose Leopold, is here. And that's Rose, and she is the Director of Business Resilience at Moderna. Very sharp rise, a very quick rise. We are very proud of you. So we'll hear from her about the practitioner perspective, and then we'll hear from Igor. And for Ben, I said that if you want somebody from academia, I sort of volunteered Marta. No, I just volunteered myself. So if you want somebody, so that will be the panel. So after your presentations, we can have some Q&A. Meanwhile, there's coffee waiting. You take your time, maybe how much, 10 minutes?
Yeah, let's take 10 minutes, and then I do have a few more announcements that I overlooked this morning. So for those of you online, we're gonna step away for 10 minutes and we'll be back. 10:45. 10:45. Thank you, everyone. There's coffee, there's plenty of danishes and yogurt in the back. Please help yourself.
Good, how are you?
I know, it's gonna be great.
Robin.
Yeah. Hey, Ben, if I make some announcements, do you just want to take over?
Sure thing, when we're ready.
I'll be in a couple minutes. So as I indicated before the break, there were several announcements I forgot to put in my opening comments. For anybody who needs Wi-Fi, there's table tents up here with the Wi-Fi address that Gabby was so gracious to provide us. And I neglected to thank three very pivotal people that helped me yesterday and today, most particularly Santiago Arietta over here, Ashish Paul in the back, and August Pausch. I could not have absolutely done this without the three of them. I was very neglectful this morning. I've already been asked, but if anybody needs to plug in, if you need power, I do have 2 extension cords, and we can just let me know and I can get you into the wall. I wanted to make sure that we said hello to Sudarshan. Good morning. I don't think I didn't notice that you were online at the beginning this morning, so good morning. We'll introduce you, we'll have you in your session later. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So there's a bunch of materials that we're laying at your table. This booklet has got the agenda in it and all of your bios for those of you that were gracious enough to provide them to me after all of the hounding. Dave, remind me to talk to you about Dan Eisenberg's. So if there's any mistakes or anything in here, I apologize. I did what I could. There's also a paper copy in the back, but the agenda is in here as of 3 days ago. There have been some changes. So if we divert from what's in here, please don't yell at me because there have
The website is updated though.
the website is updated. That is correct. As we go along, some of you have provided PowerPoint presentations. Some of the speakers have provided PowerPoint presentations. I have them printed in the back and I will be handing them out. We didn't get them the printer has very strict rules, so they didn't go into the booklet, but I did make color copies. So I'll be handing those out as we go along. If you have slides and you have not sent them to me, please approach me on one of the breaks and we'll get them uploaded on the computer and I'll run them from here. Yeah, I think that's it. Any questions for me for here? All right, Ms. Leopold, if you would join us up here. And who's my other speaker? I'm drawing a blank. Oh, Igor. Yeah. Thank you so much. Ben, it's all yours.
All right, so let's get this show on the road. We've got an hour, and it's a good panel, the best panel maybe. We'll find out. So jokes aside, we're going to be talking about climate and compound extremes. We obviously had some good Q&A this morning. I guess just a quick set of comments for this is when you're looking at this topic, it seems like every 2 or 3 years, there's just like a complete revolution in how we're treating risk and data analytics. I mean, just the improvements in processing power, new findings, and the things that get included both in the quantification of risk, as well as the visualization and communication of risk, right? The entire structure of risk governance seems to be improving. Having said that, there are a lot of gaps that we still have. This can stem from a global and international perspective, and it also scales down to very local level, local infrastructure, local communities, individual garrisons for the case of SERDP STCP. So when we're thinking about this, it's a problem that, think about where we are now, think about where you might have been 5 years ago, pre-COVID, and how much has changed since then from a data perspective, where we might be in the next 5 years, or 5 years from the conclusion of this project, and specifically where we might be able to fit in here based on the work that's being done. So with that, the only other thing is for time, let's have both speakers present individually. We'll save questions for both at the end, and then we can get back into the melee. So with that in mind, it's my privilege to introduce Ms. Rose Leopold, the Director of Business Intelligence at Moderna. And I believe, if I didn't know this, I believe that you are an alum of Northeastern based on what Auroop said. So I'm sorry I couldn't get to meet you in person, but thank you for speaking. So we'll have Ms. Leopold go first, and then Dr. Linkov. my illustrious supervisor will be going second. So take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stay seated, just given that I'm pregnant. It'll be a little more comfortable. I'm really excited to be here and give you a little bit about my practitioner perspective. So I'm currently the director for business resilience at Moderna, the biotech company that came out with the COVID vaccine in 2020. I've been at Moderna for about a year and a half. So I came in really as the pandemic was transitioning to an endemic stage. And I came in to build out our business resilience program, which didn't exist before I got there. And so I'm in charge of all emergency management, crisis management, and business continuity for our facilities around the world, really ultimately making sure that we're able to foresee, withstand, and adapt to different types of risks and disruptions, all while focusing on protecting our people, our property, our product, our reputation, and ultimately our patients. At the end of the day, everything we focus on is ensuring the resilience and the integrity of the product and therapeutics that we're providing for our patients. Moderna began as a rare disease company, and we have a lot of exciting things coming in our pipeline, in addition to our COVID vaccine. Before I sort of take it back a little bit, before I started at Moderna, I'll give you a little bit about my resilience journey. And I think for all the students, hopefully this is interesting. So I went to Northeastern here. I got my bachelor's in political science. So really, I would say not a scientist, not even really a researcher. But in my senior year, I had the great opportunity to go with Dr. Ganguly on one of his dialogue programs to India, looking at the impact of climate change and looking at climate change science and policy and its impact on critical infrastructure. And I will say that's sort of where the resilience bug bit me. And that's where I have taken my career since then. And so after that trip and that research program, I worked in his STS lab for a bit, and then also got my master's in science in security and resilience studies here at Northeastern, focusing on resilient cities and critical infrastructure resilience. I went on then to work with FEMA's Office of Response and Recovery in their Doctrine and Policy Office, developing different levels of doctrine and governance and guidance for responders, and looking at sort of doctrine at the strategic, operational, and tactical level. So everything from how does FEMA do national response operations to different types of hazards and different types of disasters, all the way down to the very tactical, how do you get the laptop to the responder as they're going from point A to point B. And so this was, I thought, really exciting work. And FEMA was really changing the way that it did business after the 2017 hurricane season. And so we all remember the 2017 hurricane season. We had Harvey, Irma, and Maria hit very hard the United States. And really, it's sort of, I would say, made a lot of folks in the federal government and FEMA in particular say the way that we're doing business isn't working. These storms are getting stronger, these storms are getting more intense. And the way that their programs were designed was that every disaster declaration, there was the entirety of FEMA resources to respond at any given point. And that's not the case. At that point, Hurricane Katrina was still an open disaster declaration for long-term recovery. And so by the time Maria hit Puerto Rico, there was almost no responders left. And so FEMA was really looking at changing up how it conducts its programming. And so I got to be a part of that, which was really exciting. I led a number of different projects there, including working on some really innovative Community Lifelines infrastructure doctrine, which provided different types of assistance to state and local governments, tribal and territorial governments, on looking at stabilizing an incident based on community lifelines, different infrastructure sectors like communications, the health and medical system, food, water, shelter, energy, power, hazardous materials, maybe one more that I'm not remembering off the top of my head. And so really saying, how can we look at different ways, a new way to stabilize an incident, stabilize a community, to provide greater recovery outcomes that ultimately bring a community back to pre-incident levels, but ideally even better than those pre-incident levels, into a greater posture for the next incident. When the pandemic hit, I spent a lot of time working for the Department of Health and Human Services Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. And back when, if you can remember, we were pulling people off of cruise ships and putting them under federal quarantine. working down at one of those quarantine sites where they were doing alternate care site operations. So if you remember when like the Javits Center in New York City was transformed into hospital surge capacity, that was an alternate care site. And so I worked on the Federal Healthcare Resilience Task Force to build out the guidance on how to create an alternate care site in your own community. So everything from how do you select a site to securing a site to staffing a site, what kind of pharmaceuticals do you need, different levels of care, everything from just, you know, a person tests positive for COVID, we want them isolated from their community, all the way to they need ICU level of care. And so working through that, and then working with FEMA back and saying, all right, now it's 2020. We are in a COVID impacted environment and we're expecting an above average Atlantic hurricane season starting in June. And so how is FEMA going to respond when its way of responding is not possible anymore? We can't mass shelter people because we're worried about COVID. We can't put everybody in a, school gymnasium and say, sleep on a cot 2 inches away from your neighbor. That wasn't going to be possible. So creating operational guidance for the federal government on how to do response and recovery in a COVID impacted environment. And then working through with some other folks, utility companies on how are they going to respond to what then became a very active wildfire season on the West Coast. And I would say when you look at, we're talking about, climate change and compounding extremes. And I would say like from a practitioner perspective, 2020 was just the year of compounding extremes. It was COVID, it was hurricanes, it was wildfires, it was more COVID, new variants. And for I would say the emergency management community, 2020 was a really tough year. But I think it really made folks say like climate change is serious. Unfortunately, we had an administration at the time that didn't want to acknowledge climate change in any federal doctrine. And so when the new administration came in 2021, there was a lot of work done to say, how can we sort of regain that ground that we lost from not talking about, extreme weather, extreme temperatures, compounding extremes and compounding incidents that come from increased climate change, increased temperatures, et cetera. But when you look at it so after 2020, 2021, I went into the private sector. I worked at Facebook for a year, building out their emergency management program, or joining Moderna in fall of 2022 to build out their program. But when you look at it from a private sector perspective, I think that even though we maybe don't have the same scope and breadth that the federal government has, or even a state government, when you look at like national response and recovery, there's a lot of interesting ways to look at compounding extremes in the private sector. And I think when you're looking at a company like where I am now that does have a global presence, we're able to really say, here are the different types of weather risks, different types of extreme weather or impacts that climate change can have. And what is that going to do to our facilities? What is that going to do to our supply chain? What is that going to do to our ability for patients to get the products that they need and the medicine that they need? And what can we do from a private sector perspective to really make sure that we're addressing those risks in our programming, in our assessments, and ultimately in the way that our programming is created. And so having the opportunity to build a program from scratch at a place like Moderna, it's given me a great sort of understanding of how to take all of these lessons learned, both from the academic perspective, from working here at Northeastern, then working throughout different types of different disasters that I worked through with the federal government, and saying, how can I take all those lessons learned and create a program that takes all of that into consideration? And so when we're doing our risk assessments, when we're doing our business impact analysis, when we're doing our business continuity planning to really ensure our continuity of operations, both manufacturing, but also making sure that our patients get what they need, we're able to take all of that into consideration to, again, sort of go back to the goal that my program has, which is to have that patient safety and ensure that our patients are able to get the life-saving therapeutics that they need. I can go into detail on any sort of those aspects, but I do want to turn it over to my other panelist up here and let him talk a little bit about his work, and then I'm happy to answer any questions.
I guess we have to do some magic here, but let me start. It's really, I'm really honored to be in Northeastern. Actually, how did you call it? Like buck of resilience. So my buck of resilience started in 2011 or 12. I don't even remember now. But I get my first big project on resilience, and I went to Northeastern, and I kind of have the idea that resilience should be about networks. Of course, if you're talking about network, you go to Professor Barabashi, and I went to him and I said, well, I get this, like, my first $500,000 big project on resilience. Can you help me? And he said, well, I don't accept any money if I don't know the answer. And he said, well, I just starting on resilience. By the way, I talked to Professor Gao, who is here now. And I went to Professor Gao, and he was sitting in like little cube and asking, what do you know about resilience? And he said, well, I just studied. I don't know anything about resilience. So long story short, Professor Barabashi didn't let me work with him. So I had to do it myself. So I hired two postdocs, and this is how the whole resilience story with me started. Yeah, that's when we started to work with Maxim Kitsak, who is still part of my team. In this presentation, obviously, Ben was already around. He was a student at that point. So many co-authors should be listed here. I don't know why I listed only myself. But again, to your point, even though chief of staff in my chain of commands somewhere up in the cloud, but this is only my views. And I guess I consider my job to bring new science in DoD, and sometimes it's so novel that obviously chief of staff will have different opinion. That's what they should, but I see my job in bringing new science. And this is actually a statement of needs for this program. And I was, at that point, I was part of SERDP technical advisory committee. So a lot of that is reflective of what I thought back in 2018 when we started to work on that. And I like to remind this group now, when 6 years later, that the goal, at least vision that we had back then, is to really think about theory of resilience, compounding threats, how to deal with that, not necessarily, some minor issue in multiplex networks. I know that in academia, that's what you guys do, and you're excited about that. But back to the comments from my esteemed colleague here, we really need, at that point, very practical things within DoD that will help us to address all these compounding threats that are hitting us. You have climate change as a kind of stressor, and you have multiple shocks related to supply chain, personal issues, all these factors that affects us in use every day. But again, I hope that within these projects, you will have a room to think about messaging that we can use in Department of Defense as well as in industry. Because the problem with resilience, and I will go through that in my presentation, is not that we cannot do multiplex networks or really detailed analysis. The problem is that chief of staffs need to have a message that they can understand and they can trust and they can rely on. And that's where the challenge is at the moment. And this is like one example of challenge. NATO has this concept of layered resilience. Back in Warsaw Declaration of 2019, they say, well, we need layered resilience, right? Till now, they have not developed concept of layered resilience, what they mean. And this is actually from my paper that is now under review. I worked with NATO ACT, that kind of transformation side. They mean by layered resilience interaction of civilian and military infrastructure. Look what is happening in Ukraine, right? Arguably, the reason Ukraine managed to have success in the war is because of civilian infrastructure. So NATO views is that somehow civilian and military infrastructure should be interconnected. And, this is kind of our view on that it's like this buffer zone that integrate both of them that needs to be developed further. But, this is kind of next phase of that. NATO actually require all partner countries to develop national resilience plans. And again, that was like, 5-6 years ago. And the first attempt to develop national resilience plan in the US happened on the last year of Trump administration. And they formed on the National Security Council committee. I kind of managed to get in there, but obviously nothing happened. The committee was dropped. And funny enough, the same happened with Biden administration. So now we have committee. We have been working on that. And it looks like it may be released relatively soon. There are other documents at national level, National Resilience Guidance, which is evolvement of PPD 21 of 2013, one of the first resilience guidance that executive office developed. So that was Obama's directive. And then obviously we have agency-specific documents like climate adaptation plan, I guess that's OSD, and you have Army-specific documents. Then within Army Corps, we actually try to observe all that and develop. And one of the projects I'm going to show is how we try to really develop a major resilience strategy at watershed scale that matching all these high-level national DoD and Army Corps documents, right? On my side, I, as a scientist, I see resilience as kind of abstracting from real world that is very complicated with these models of interconnected layers. I like to develop management alternatives that act on all this in a way that have enhancement in resilience of the whole system. What does it mean? And this is like kind of variation of the slides that I was using from the very beginning. And in this case, actually, out of frustration of what's happening in federal government, that we, well, I should not say that. What's happening in federal government is that there is a lot of confusion about threat, vulnerability, consequences that are part of risk, and resilience, that is kind of recovery and adaptation for me. And in federal government, we're still struggling with clarifying this message. So what we did here, we tried to visualize that, bring in business and industry. And actually now I'm working with Gartner to really clarify message that industry can take. We have just heard about business continuity, right? And operational resilience, organizational resilience. So this is what industry is trying to use. In government, we don't have similar concept. But to make long story short, the point here is that we formalize resilience early enough as kind of mixture of social and physical science, right? We introduced this notion of critical function of the system that basically reflective of what the mission is. And it's very different from risk. Risk is looking at component of the system and try to assess probability of failure using threat, vulnerability, consequences to reflect. All right, so this first inflection point is actually what we do with risk assessment. We have functional system and you have a threat, you have a shock and system goes down, and we don't like it to happen. We like system to be functional no matter what hits us. But if you get out of this green zone, you cannot recover functionality easily. You are not reliable. You are not robust. You basically fail your business continuity. We really put business continuity in this green zone. Business continuity is more or less normal fluctuation in whatever supply chain, personnel, and all that can be fixed without crisis, right? You get in crisis zone and you are in this inflection point too, when you're already sick, right? You call your physician to really figure out what's wrong with you. And at that point, all you know about risk is not working, right? You cannot have a scenario, how you get down. You are down, you sick. And what is interesting is that your body, with help of physician, is trying to figure out this recovery pathway. And in one of the committee under Office of Science and Technology Policy, we released last year this resilience pathway document. There, look, the idea there is like you have different pathway to get back, and you need to figure out the science and practice around that. And that document obviously is collective view of the committee. I have slightly different view, but nevertheless, the idea that you are down and you need to start to think about how to get you back at the level of functionality that is sufficient to sustain your life or your critical function if you're a military installation. This is a really serious conversation, and I would argue that we don't have much of science developed. Back to my comment, if you're talking about compounding threats, they actually look at this, individual components of the system. The whole apparatus of risk assessment is focused on prioritizing all these little balls from point of view of how likely they have failed. And, if this ball is likely to fail, we invest in that more than in that ball. Obviously, that's not as simple as that, but nevertheless, we try to find the biggest point of failure and we try to harden it. In resilience, we're talking about recovery. So, early enough in the process, given all these problems with definition, different views and all that, I thought, okay, and this is why I came to Barabashi, like how we quantify resilience, right? Because then no matter how we call it, you have math equation and you use it. So we start to work on different way to quantify resilience. And in most general way, you have metrics-based and model-based approaches. And a lot what we see here, it's kind of simulation network game theoretical side, which is like kind of high end of model-based approaches. And they're perfectly fine for resilience, But on the other extreme, people just use KPIs, individual metrics. This is what industry is using. They track a couple of metrics and based on that, people get bonuses and solve problems. But what we try to push is from these metrics, indices, and dashboards towards decision analytics. When you try to match mission with multiple metrics reflective of different components of the system. And this is what we call resilience matrix. And that was one of the first paper that I actually did with Dan Eisenberg, who is talking tomorrow. Unfortunately, he's not here. The story is that Dan joined my team as an intern after his bachelor's, and I let's work on resilience. And he went to Northeastern and meet Steve Flynn. I hope he will be here at some point. And that was our beginning of resilience. And this was the first paper that Dan Eisenberg helped me with. When we really look at concept of network-centric operation in military, we look at physical, cyber, social, and cognitive domains of the system. It's like more generic way to represent the system. And then we overlap it with this temporal dynamics of resilience, right? You have prepare, absorb, recover, and adapt. And now, if you have all different KPIs that Moderna or whoever else may be using, you can place them in one of these cells, right? And moreover, if you have the structure, not only you can place whatever you measure, you can say, okay, all my KPIs are in prepare, absorb, in physical domain. Of course, social domain is important. Of course, cyber domain is important. Do I need to measure it? Maybe, maybe not. What we've done, we say, okay, depending on your needs, depending on what you do, cyber domain and social domain may or may not be important. If I'm Army Corps of Engineers, obviously we build infrastructure, so physical is important for me. I cannot build infrastructure without understanding what community wants. So I would put less weights on social domain methods, but I need them. They are part of my system, so I cannot look at the system without thinking about social domain or cyber domain, because that's where information is coming from. So that was the idea of resilience matrix. Is how you fuse together subjective information about your mission space and objective measures that you have to do. And then back to resilience quantification. Yes, you cannot measure resilience in kilograms, so any absolute units, but what we do here, we develop what we call utility function. It's kind of unitless structure that has objective metrics weighted with values or importance of this metrics for your mission or me as a decision maker. So based on that, I don't have this on the right. I don't have exact number of resilience, but I have this kind of unitless bars that reflective of this weighted sum that I'm calculating. And if I manage to drive one metric up, obviously the whole resilience goes up. And if I drive it by combination of metric really way high, obviously it costs me. Changing each metrics require, more energy generators or more stakeholder meetings or more education. It has cost, but I can see, given this imaginary thresholds that somehow we need to define, I can see where am I with cost and enhancement of resilience, right? So we start applying it to really Army Corps scales through our emergency operations community for watershed resilience. The problem is we manage at watershed scale, right? That's kind of our objectives. But the problem is in the watershed, you have a bunch of communities and we obviously need to manage communities, manage their needs. And, if one community likes to have flood protection and, seawalls solution for them, and another community likes to have natural environment, the nature-based solution is best for them. We cannot build seawall, drop it on the board of community and do wetlands, right? So this kind of requires consensus building, collective judgment. So this project is actually integrate resilience matrix as a consensus building tool where we try to build all these metrics together and prepare Army Corps to act in emergency situation in a way that communities are engaged. We know what communities need, and analytical driver for that is like this weighted sum resilience quantification metrics. So it's large projects. We are second year. We have a couple of universities supporting us. I think it's moving very nice. But of course, back to Professor Barabashi, it always was my dream to really have a network-based resilience structure, right? So, and we define resilience based on topology, property of links, nodes, network structure. This slide is literally over 10 years old. So I use it like from my very first presentation. And why it's important, again, with Samartha and, Samrad and others, all these resilience networks, that's great. But this is like what we worked with Maxim Kitsak, and he said, well, for network science, it's just homework for one of classes. But what we did, we looked at civilization that existed, 3,000 years ago. And what is amazing is that you have this kind of world of 3,000 years ago with civilization that were really advanced. They have like in Crete, they have like 3 types of different water. If you go to those palaces, you're amazed with quality of frescoes and structures and all that. And what was really amazing, and this is like actually Ben, who started all this work, we noticed that all the civilization collapsed in really short time frame, 50 years. They existed like for 1,000 years and they collapsed in 50 years. And why? What happened? Well, climate change was one of the factors there. People were saying climate change, then, they collapse. But in 50 years, probably it's not going to happen. For sea people, these bad guys came and crushed the civilization. Well, they were always there. It's not like, in 50 years, all of a sudden you have army of them to kill like everybody in Egypt, right? It's not going to happen. So we start to work with Eric Klein, who is one of the famous archaeologists who studied this. And basically his idea was it's compounding threats, right? That's compounding threats that kill all of them. And was a spectacular failure in time from 50 years. And then the question is how it's going to happen. So initially what we did, we tried to get Maxim and other people to really say, okay, you have the civilization. We use Eric Klein work to figure out all connections, how they connected through the network. And, you know, as a good network scientist, we try to kill links and nodes and see how you can disrupt them. Obviously, if you kill all links and nodes, you know, you're going to kill everything, right? You know, this basically, if you kill like a lot of them, the whole network will fail. Well, that's not that, but anyway. Basically, with meaningful number of, you know, disruptions, we were unable to disrupt civilizations of the past, right? So then what we did, we started to say, okay, can we separate in layers and have a cascading failure? So this is compounding threats, right? And we look at political layer is basically who is married to whom, what kind of connections the civilization have with each other, you know, which one they befriend, which one they fight, and trade layer. And if then we say, well, if Babylon is stressed in one of these layers, it's supposed to be stressed in another. Very simple model. We managed to collapse the civilization with meaningful way. You can see if you kill two of them, you have this on the left. Well, it's like 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if you kill two, you have two scenarios that collapse the whole world order past. And apparently one of the scenario was historically plausible. So what does it tell us? That these cascading failures can really crush civilizations. Even if you start with a couple of countries that may not be strongest, but probably better connected, and that can crush the whole world order. Now, think about what's happening today. What we have Ukraine, Israel, Gaza. It may be not the most important area, but also well connected. You know, something happened in Ukraine, you know, Africa starves, right? Because Ukraine provides a lot of food supply. So in this paper, we really make an argument that, you know, as Babylons of the past, countries like US should really think about the whole network because it's in our power to really help countries and prevent potential societal collapse that may happen in a very spectacular way if you're not thinking about compounding threats, right? So, okay, why I'm telling you this story? Because this is kind of the messaging that we need to have, right? We need to kind of get to people who are not network scientists, something that they can relate to. Yeah, question.
Yes, I'm sorry. A very naive question, but all these civilizations, they weren't at the exact same time.
Sorry?
All these civilizations, they were not at the exact same time in history. They were spread apart over several centuries, and some started at some point, some ended at another point, and etc. So,
well,
can it trade across all of them?
Sir, we're running short on time, but I will say these were the extant grouped powers, accurate as of about 1177 BC.
Yeah, so this is a snapshot of world order in 1177, plus minus a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, Ben likes me to move faster. We've done a lot of work with transportation. Marta shows some transportation example. I'm not going to go over it, we published, but one important consideration that I like you to think about is what are the cost of lack of resilience versus lack of efficiency, right? So we connected some of this resilience transportation model, not as sophisticated as Marta's, but, you know, relatively good one. And this is what you see, that efficiency is like, you know, amount of traffic that you have, how much time you stay in traffic. Resilience is how quickly you can recover from major accidents, right? And we connect this transportation model with regional economic model. And you can see that cost of lack of efficiency are much smaller than lack of resilience. Why? Because obviously, if I know that I can be up to whatever 45 minutes in traffic getting to my office, I'm not scheduling important meetings, but rather I schedule meetings like 1 hour after I left home. But if you are stuck in a bridge in San Francisco, because it's very not resilient cities, you know, you may missing like important meetings and all that. So that's kind of line of work that we've done, published. Now, back to compounding threats. Again, this is like back to what we heard in COVID time. COVID plus hurricane, we had completely to revise our evacuation strategy for FEMA, for ASPER, because, you know, if you have flood and you need to get people, you cannot stuck them in a school gym as we did before. You need to do something else. So that was one of the projects that we published in Nature Sustainability a while back. Another cool example of COVID time, we tried to model propagation of COVID within the building. That was a big issue in return to work, a micro-exposure model that connects with strategies that you can do. Actually, this work is really moved now to molded military installation. Mold is a big issue, and this is, again, I'm not talking about climate change, but this is where it connects. Climate change is a stress. A mold can happen spontaneously all over, and this is mold across US, and we develop a model of mold formation and building given a climate, given what's happening outside of the building and what's happening inside, right? And all of a sudden, this combination of climate and properties of the surfaces, circulation of air, it's all result in mold formation. This is ongoing work. Ben is involved in public health side of that, but again, we are looking for sponsors at this point. The biggest project I have on compounding side is actually DARPA work on supply chain. I was lucky to be able to frame this, help DARPA to frame this program, and this is probably as good as it gets in the world of network resilience at the moment in government. We have, it's like probably $50 million program. We have people working on building this network out of available data on supply and demand, assessing risk in TS3. And what I'm especially happy is TS3, it's stress testing for resilience. It's methodology to figure out how resilient these networks are. So this is like supply and demand network. We had session and society for risk analysis meeting last year. It's a really active project, probably the only one in government, at least in DoD, that focus on resilience analytics and supply chain. There are many supply chain illumination work when you can really see what's happening, but this is the only one on analytics. Okay, so how we can improve resilience again, with Ben and others, we look at resilience by design or resilience by intervention. So it is like you can design system to be more resilient, but you can intervene. Everybody likes me to move fast. Okay, I think this is my last slide. I don't see any presentation nowadays without AI. So we're actually looking at bringing AI to help primarily with unknown unknowns. In resilience, you often, as I mentioned, you really cannot know everything. Something may hit you that you don't know. So the structure that integrates data fabric and all this heterogeneous information in different units to really look at the network. This is what we're working on. One of the ideas we're pushing now is with zero trust in kind of, well, cyber environment. Anyway, okay, let me stop here. I can talk longer. Okay.
All right. So we have maybe about 15 to 20 minutes left. I do have prepared questions, but I wanted to see for folks that have been listening very politely, what are there any questions that you have locally? We can take 2 or 3 at a time even. So any quick questions from
Dion? We have one from Dion. Yes, please.
Thank you. Hi, Professor.
Just a little bit.
Hi, Professor. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Dian. I'm member of SDS Lab, working with Professor Ganguly. This is very interesting because totally interested because Savannah and Ciliwung, if you ever heard about Jakarta in Indonesia, like has similar problem, even though Savannah is larger than Ciliwung. So actually, this is not direct question, but do you think it is possible if we can manage Jakarta, like especially Ciliwung, because we have very massive agriculture in the upstream and then very dense population in the downstream. It's totally almost covered 90% of the watershed. Do you think it's possible to manage this kind of watershed?
Well, I mean, it's always possible to manage watershed. It's not clear what the result will be, but I mean, it's better to manage it based on at least some understanding of what's going on rather than just based on politics or local views, right? So that the whole idea, like Army Corps supposed to manage in watershed, we have a bunch of assets in the watershed that we can control. The question that we're asking, what is the best strategy for us, for Army Corps, to deal with what we can manage given community needs and given certain future, right? So can we do it in Jakarta? Of course. I mean, it's just metrics will be different, stakeholder values will be different, geopolitics will be different, but I mean, methodologically, yeah, I mean, it's the same. I mean, the difference of network science that we see with SMART and others is that you discretize the system in kind of community level scale or whatever scales you like, and you use integrated metrics and you connect them. You can really look at correlations rather than explicit modeling that these guys do. So, and again, the reason for us to do that, it's not that we cannot do network science. We can, maybe not as good as Martha, but we still can. But it's very difficult to sell this. And Julia Rosati was here. I mean, somehow people trust our flood models. They are maybe even more complex than network models, but they don't trust networks model yet, right? So, I mean, the way to get to that is through kind of small steps.
So Ben, if I can take a quick question.
Go for it. Yep.
Thanks. So this, credibility, trustworthiness, or the trusting of models, that makes me think. So it's very rare that we have somebody from government practitioners sitting together talking about resilience, and a theoretician and a practitioner. So my question will start with Rose, but then hopefully it will go back to Igor. Is, as you saw all the things that Igor presented, and feel free to be honest, I mean, we are among friends here. Does that have any relevance for you? And before you answer that, so any relevance in terms of either the theory or the concept? I mean, Igor is one person who helped us, meaning the royal we, meaning the community, understand what resilience, how we should frame resilience. So that being said, as you look at it, is the community in a direction which will be helpful to you? And to the extent that it is, how can it be further enhanced? If it is not, what can be done? And then going back to Igor, what will you bring to help a practitioner?
That's a great question. I almost wish you had presented first, because watching your presentation, I was like, oh yeah, like that's how we maybe don't call it the exact same thing or use the exact same models, but the underlying theory is the same. And so when you're building up a program in industry, when you want it to be built on sort of the cutting edge research of the practice, basically. And I think that's what you're doing. You're creating that. I think the only thing that I would say is really, continue to share that information to practitioners. And there are so many great organizations out there who really, people want to be on the cutting edge in continuity and resilience and risk. And they're looking for ways to take some of that, like this new research, these new models, but then be able to apply it in their day-to-day work. And the struggle that I have in industry and that I have had is getting the stakeholder buy-in. So even what you were saying to her, you know, you need to, you know, maybe start small and build up from that and gain that trust. And it's the same thing I would say in the private sector. You have all this great research, you have all these great slides, and then you get 2 minutes to make your case to the executive, or maybe you get 2 slides in a deck that's 100 slides long, and you know do they remember all that information? I don't know, and so it can sometimes be like a very iterative process to gain that buy-in, because at the end of the day, what I'm doing is not bringing in money for the business. It's not making profit, but it is ultimately protecting, you know, the people and the work that's being done to make that profit for the company. And you know, if there were a massive disruption, if there was no resilience in a business, then the company would suffer financially. And so really understanding where some of those financial risks are and those operational risks, and even compliance and reputational risks, being able to explain that to that senior leadership, those executives, in a way that they'll understand. And I think if there's ways to almost take the research that you're doing, take the research that you all are working on, and I mean, distill it down into a couple slides, or say, like, here's what you really need to know. Like, here's the bottom line up front. I think that would ultimately help a lot of practitioners, especially those that maybe work for smaller organizations, or even, you know, maybe even are the local emergency manager in a county or a state, and, you know, they have no budget. And so they're trying to make the case of why doing these resilience or mitigation or adaptation measures is important to the locality or the organization. But the money doesn't want to be spent because it's not something that's happening right now. It's just something that maybe will happen if you don't mitigate and adapt to those threats and risks, and the compounding extremes that we're seeing every single year. And ultimately then that hurts the community or hurts the organization. So I would say, like, everything you were saying is exactly what I sort of see on a day-to-day basis, just without the nice charts or the nice graphs. But it's how do you make that communication to your stakeholders, to your leadership, to your executives. And I think that's probably where people like me in industry struggle, is just to gain that buy-in, gain that people taking it seriously. And so the more tools that are out there to show them, like, this is the cutting edge, this is where the research is going, this is where the practice, the discipline as a whole is going, you know, here's how the government is going, we should be in line with that, I think would be helpful.
This is so interesting. This is almost exactly, I mean, I cannot verbatim, almost word for word, what we heard in the startup workshop.
It is.
Explain. This is great stuff. Explain to somebody who, you know, broader specialist audience, but thank you.
No, I think I 100% agree. So maybe we need to move to another question, but the question is really well answered.
Hold on one second, Ben. Any other questions in the room? Sam?
I mean, I can, so just curious, thank you, Rose, for your perspective on the state of the science, state of the practice. I was just, you know, as you were describing, I was thinking, like, so given that, you know, we're in kind of a post-pandemic world now, are we better prepared, or are we going to be better prepared, more resilient for the next pandemic? Just curious about your thoughts.
I was gonna say, I'd like to think yes. In reality, I don't know. My personal opinion, but we all saw the way that people reacted to the pandemic in 2020, even 2021, the way they're still reacting, the way that I think artificial intelligence maybe plays a more negative role, with deep fakes and misinformation and all of that. I think that ultimately hurts both researchers and practitioners in the next sort of worldwide pandemic or emergency or whatever it might be, and that people can say, well, I don't trust this. I don't trust the information I'm getting. And so while I'd like to think that we are more prepared in some ways, I think there's probably other ways that we're not. I don't think we would ever, if there was another pandemic started tomorrow, there's no way we would be able to get away with lockdowns and mask wearing and all of that. And unfortunately, I think that there would just be this rebellion, but it goes back to that trust issue. People lost the trust in their leadership, whether that's, health leadership, government leadership, their community leadership, whatever. And it will take time to gain that back. And so maybe, but I think also in some ways, no.
Yeah, again, my own view and my own observation. It looks like nobody likes to hear about pandemics anymore. Like we were supposed to get significant funding from ASPR to really formalize the supply chain infrastructure. Their funding was cut, didn't get it. So the other metric, I told Ross and Ben, obviously, in March 2020, I was hired as statistician for 2 weeks to help ASPR and FEMA in New England. And when I started, I realized that they have like half a person responsible for data analytics, and she's a lawyer, right? So obviously, both people worked under Ben's supervision like for 2 years on data analytics and messaging to ASPR and FEMA. So did they learn our lessons? Yes, they now have like one full-time person. Is it enough for data analytics regionally in the time of crisis? Of course not. I think the major issue is like recognition of resilience as the main driver, but I mean, has it formalized in any, are we better prepared? I don't think so. I mean, we are about the same.
Let me, I just quick aside, let me give you a slight note of optimism. I think that the muscle memory is there. I think in general that people like your institutions have gone through a significant learning process that they haven't really had to do since 1918 and 1919. And the initial response, like the population's initial adherence to various rules and recommendations, depending on what state you live in, regarding COVID, they were wildly successful in March and April and May of 2020. The cracks that formed early, again, trust is a big issue. The other side of this is, what do you do when you're confronted by something else? And this is what, for me, really convinced me that compounding threats, it's not just a theoretical exercise. One of the earliest calls I got, so for 2 years, Igor and I worked as strategic planners to Region 1 with FEMA, ASPR, and CISA, all again in Region 1 in the 6 New England states. But we provided a lot of support to different USACE jurisdictions, as well as command and controls, not command and control, different COCOMs, particularly UCOM, AFRICOM, and INDOPACOM at different points in time. So one of the earliest calls that I got on the military side was for a district commander at USACE. Won't name the district. Again, great folks. Just won't name names right now, but you can probably guess they're a coastal one. And a question was raised, like, Ben, approaching summer of 2020. We understand all the COVID guidance. We know what we're doing. What am I supposed to do if I'm hit by a Category 2 hurricane? How do I social distance inside an evacuation center? How do I keep the hospitals open? And what infrastructure do I build? And the answer is we just don't really have the answers yet. And that's where things like this project are really valuable, both from a threat specific and a threat agnostic approach, because those questions are going to come if and when we are struck by a new pandemic. You're going to have parts of the country that some are not going to be afflicted by risk, and some are. It might be a hurricane, it might be a wildfire, it might be a flood, it might be a wet bulb incident, it might be a freeze incident like we saw in Texas. That's when things are going to go much more wrong than what we saw from 20 to 22 if we don't have things like this to push us forward.
So on that note of optimism, since you're running half an hour late, if we can, thank the speaker, thank the moderator, and the next panel is going to delve into something that Igor has been alluding to, ARTA, and of course everybody else. So so who Marta, you are running the panel, right?
Yes. And Jack and Dinesh, ask questions to the panelists.
Yes, please feel free to ask your questions at lunch. We are all here.
I am similarly excited as Ben with his panel. I think this is the best panel. We are going to be talking about methods and theories for installation. Our two speakers have 15 to 20 minutes each, and then we open it up for questions. And we will start with Dr. Leonardo Dueñas Osorio, from Civil Engineering at Price University. Thank you, Leonardo. Lord. Yours. Can I help you?
Yeah. Here.
You just send me an email.
How are you?
So, Leonardo, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you and good morning, everyone. I'll be speaking over your coffee or even lunch is going to be served, but I'm going to be trying to be quick here, giving you some landscape of methods and algorithms that we use, quantify resilience, reliability, make it in a way that is verifiable, such that is useful for decision making. So the first thing to make algorithms useful to decision makers is let's build on what has worked, because people trust that. So we have examples here. Space industry, nuclear power, lifeline systems. We have had our share of catastrophic failures in the past, but we have also learned quite a lot, and we are confident that some of these systems perform as intended. If you see the nuclear reactor odds of failure, those are 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million, and we're still confident they are in those ballparks during operational conditions and contingencies. Those odds of failure are small because there is compounding failures. We just don't know what could come. We might know about the earthquakes, about the hurricanes, but there are many other things that might compound operationally, cooling pipes, what have you. So we have learned, the main thing we've learned from these complex systems that we have been relatively successful at operating and maintaining is we designed the individual components as reliable as possible, such that the system has a target functionality somewhat guaranteed. That's me at the bottom right. In Chile, after the earthquake in 2010, there's an ultra high voltage substation, supposed not to fail, but it did. Very strong earthquakes. It was redundant, and Chile came back after that earthquake relatively quickly. It was an example of resilience. They know they have earthquake hazards, and they design things planning for the worst. Another way to learn to inform the algorithms and methods is to track communities. So this is just one example. I've been involved with a NIST project on resilience, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. We have been tracking several communities. This is one of them, Lumberton, North Carolina, small community, 20,000, hit by multiple hurricanes, Florence, Matthew, and they wanted to come back. You have these sort of repeated hazards, but it's compounded by the socioeconomic landscape. And last visit was last year. So we have been doing a longitudinal study of resilience, 6 visits over 7 years. And I'm just highlighting here things that happened because the lessons were learned, and we don't want these things to happen again. First, in the top left, it's not because of me, it's in the background, you have a 79 megawatt solar energy farm, just to have local energy. Road elevation, this is a national security issue, that's I-95. Well, it got flooded, it got disrupted, it's gonna be elevated, the construction already started, 13 feet over the standard or the current level, 4 meters. We don't want that to happen. The I-95 is gonna become essentially a flood protection system. DoD helped the community, but is taking advantage of these windows. This project would have never happened had not Lumberton, North Carolina, a small community, be hit twice by hurricane and having catastrophic consequences in the community. So it's also an opportunistic positive side. Water systems, that's a 1 million gallon tank there. It's very pretty. It was a runner-up for the best tank of the nation in 2018 or so. They built another 500,000 gallon tank to have redundancy and resilience. This is an electrical substation that in the center. You see that black or brownish paneling, that's aluminum panels that are sealed, and the only entry is now here at the front, lower right. It can be sealed when the next flood comes. So it's going to be an entirely sealed substation. You cannot move those very easily. To relocate some, but not many. So that's another way of resilience. And the local communities also learned. FEMA helped a lot, elevating systems, mechanical equipment, and the like. So we learn all this, and how do we put it in practice? When we talk to these communities, one way of synthesizing the decision process is like in that little chart, where if you start from the left-hand side, you have essentially options. What can you do to make your community resilient? And when I say community, you can also think of your installation or your system of study. So you have choices at the left-hand side, what to do. And for everything that you do, you will face contingencies, you will face uncertainties. So those are the circles, those are called chance nodes, or the contingency nodes. You can have the hazards, and you can have the compounding hazards, hazard after hazard, or sequential. Regardless, at the very end, you have some losses that you need to still quantify. So the idea is when we reason with decision makers, like the town hall managers or the city managers or some of the utility companies, this sort of abstraction is very useful because it's intuitive. You have alternatives, you have contingencies, you have consequences, and you just need to pick what is the alternative that satisfies your objectives the best. Now, this is a tree, and as you know, trees grow pretty quickly as you have more contingencies and more alternatives. So it becomes a problem of computational search. But the search that you do in computation is, well, finding these combinations that might be the more catastrophic, the more extreme, and let's see if we can afford to do something about it. So we go into managing all those uncertainties by sampling. We saw many presentations this morning. I didn't see much of the uncertainty management, but the idea is that you have to run many times these sort of algorithms and methods, such that you get a sort of a statistical perspective of it. You don't trust it entirely, but you get a sense of what is the range of outcomes, such that you, again, can pick the best solution. You can pick, these outcomes are actually used in practice. You see, in practice, you see the expected monetary value, energy not supplied. This is in the power industry. System average interruption indices, conditional value at risk is used in the finance and others. This is averages of the totals or averages of the tails. So you can be risk averse. We tend to be more risk averse, better to plan in the risk averse regime for the compounding effects. But then, since it is sampling based, it's very expensive. Once you are doing power flow analysis, water flow analysis, system dynamics, we cannot afford to do as many simulations as we would like, so as not to miss those configurations or those triggers that can be really catastrophic. So what do? We try to design sort of better sampling algorithms. Here, the sketch that I have there is if you have two inputs that are random, what you would like is to pick combinations of them, check if the system is okay or not, and keep tally of the ones that are worse. That's what we do most of the time. We call that the Monte Carlo simulation. And in the bottom right is sort of a heuristic. It's kind of shaded there in blue, but there are other techniques that are less heuristic in the sense that you can have more control on the quality of your results. And when you have a little bit more control on the quality of results, you tell that or you discuss those with your sort of stakeholders, and it goes better. The conversation goes better because at least puts boundaries in what is possible based on what we know. It's not that we have the right answer, but at least we have boundaries on what is plausible. So these are examples. Some colleagues of mine in California and the UCLA, it's the water network, earthquakes. They try to determine the critical elements, so you might see them there, reds and blues. But the point is, they afforded to do 1,000 realizations. Okay, is that enough? You find the configurations that might have led to more catastrophic failures? Maybe not. So I went to search some of my journals and colleagues, and here it became an uncertainty quantification soup. You see some are doing 10,000. They see here at the top. And next in the red box for earthquake, combining tsunami and the earthquake itself or jointly, 10,000. Then some start getting 50,000. This is earthquake. Give me more. This is more like a bit. Well, here it has 200,000 samples. Okay, is that good enough? Who knows? Somebody's realizing that some things are rare enough that maybe 1 million is needed. And then somebody's saying 1 billion. Okay. How many simulations can we afford? So it depends on the system and the model. But the point is, we need to have a better stopping rule so that we can really have the discussions such that when we talk to the stakeholders, we say, hey, this is the most possible thing. Is have some boundaries on it. But this is too heuristic. So the boundaries are coming from a couple of things. First of all, if you look at the left-hand side, I had mentioned the reactors, the nuclear reactors, 100,000, even a wind turbine, that is not that critical. We still decided for not failing 1,000. For an average person like you and I, 0.001 and 0.00001 makes no difference. Why? Behavioral psychologists tell us in the right-hand side, that's how we interpret probabilities. In the right-hand side, you see highly unlikely at the bottom, or almost no chance. Those are in between 0 and 10%. That's sort of our ability, naturally, to perceive odds of something in our day-to-day life. So we need to have the methods that combine all these things, that we are reasonably confident about the small odds of things going wrong, but at the same time conveying the message that that's relevant. And even if it is not natural for us to see things that are 1 in a million or smaller. So that's the Monte Carlo part is here in the left-hand side. One of the best ways is something that we are not doing enough, which is having stopping rules based on the theory of Monte Carlo. Monte Carlo is a Bernoulli experiment. And you can backtrack and say, hey, I need N samples to at least have some level of confidence. So those formulas exist. People have them, but we are not using them quite enough. So that's call for action. But there is more than that. There is, I don't know if you have been aware of, but there is Las Vegas simulation as well. Those are more accountable algorithms. They tend to be more expensive. They give you an error, obviously, but at least you are more confident. The confidence bounds are more sort of guaranteed. How do you do that? We go away from the standard thing that we say central limit theorem, everything start looking Gaussian. We go back to the Russians, Chebyshev, Markov, Chekhov. That's 100 years ago. They say they were dealing with physical systems. If you have a typical behavior and a typical behavior, not typical, it cannot be too far from the typical one. Otherwise, you are not dealing with something physical. So they reverse engineer the math, and we can have stopping rules that give us more sort of realistic answers. If we comply with those, we are more confident that our results are within some error, some confidence, but we can be more certain about those. Now, you see Monte Carlo, Las Vegas. There is also Atlantic City simulation, but I don't have time for that, but just plant the seed there. So those are called probably approximately correct algorithms. And I think those are better received because when we talk to the stakeholder, we say, hey, this is our better estimate, but we have this big error and we are not that much confident on it. But that's sort of more forthcoming with instead of just giving an answer coming out of the simulation alone. So what else can we do? Putting the sampling aside, we also have tools for the methods and the algorithms that are based on understanding the sort of combinatorial world in which networks live. Infrastructure networks are collections of discrete elements, and they can fail or not. So they have a lot of configurations of failure. We need to deal with that. So I'm going to be quick in the next few slides just to show you what is possible. The first thing is we realize that infrastructure networks are special. They have some properties, so you can decompose them. And if you decompose them, you can even decompose them sort of efficiently, like in the right-hand side, you have sort of compilation of the knowledge there. And you can construct bounds. Essentially, you identify what fails, what not fails, and you can slowly but surely build your way into, hey, this is the estimate of the performance of the system. If you need to stop at some point because it's too expensive, you have bounds. You have a credible bound, and you will see if that is enough for you to make decisions. We tried those strategies of decomposition with a variety of realistic systems, transportation, water, gas, from colleagues of mine. And, the sizes are on the hundreds of components. There is a property from network that is the tree width. It's just how tree-like it is. It's a combinatorial property. People in network science also are trying to get into more combinatorial properties. But the point is, a lot of our realistic networks have low tree width. And we're able to solve all these exactly by decomposition. We just didn't know that the tree width was so low for them. Every one of those studies there is being Monte Carlo simulation. And again, you get Monte Carlo simulation result, but if you can remove Monte Carlo, you get an answer that is removing uncertainty. So is it better than having uncertainty? Ideally, yes. So there is another strategy. Now that we build on that success, can we formulate a network reliability problem just in the most fundamental language of all, which is Boolean logic? Things are there or not there, or yes, no. We were able to write Boolean formula like at the one at the top for a network reliability problem that's a conjunction of these junctions. And we did that way that the creative part was translating our problem into Boolean logic. People in AI, people in computer science have been dealing with Boolean logic for 40 years. Once we translated our problem into that, we put it into a solver of theirs, and we solved all these test beds. These are telecommunication networks. Our line is this green one. The dotted orange is sort of the decomposition algorithms, they do well. And the state of the practice is the blue one. So again, methods and theories, if we can translate some of our problems into techniques that are formal and that can guarantee the results, why not? This logic, if you get that result, you get that result. Essentially, if you are reliable, it says yes. If you are not, it says no. It has, it's sort of an exact type of algorithm. The next few slides, it's a stand there, but it's there, gonna be really quick, is once we have damage, we have to bring things back to function. So here at the top, let's say we have a system, power and gas, interdependent, elements fail, we have to bring them back. In this mentality of solving things in a principled way, in a way that you can at least have some guarantee of your results or some optimality gaps, or because there are many heuristic algorithms also from the optimization. But if you can formulate in these cases, so-called mixed integer programming, the equation is there just to show that there are a variety of dimensions that you care about, like the reconstruction, the supply or not, the operational cost. Every element has a physical sort of interpretation, like a pipe there. It goes from I to J, it's in network K, carries community L, it goes in time T. So it's a very comprehensive. And what you do with optimization is you try to find what is the order of repairs, when and where to do them, so that you minimize the cost and the time to restore the whole system. You account for constraints, physical constraints, supply demands. But what we notice is that interdependent networks tend to be sparsely interdependent. Most of the time in physical systems, we have them there, like the block diagonals are the main networks, and there are the off-diagonal terms that are the interdependent points. You know, the electricity for the supply, for the pump, and the like. You can solve these very efficiently. So let me give you an example. Well, no, before the example. So this is for one system. If you take into account time, this was two systems, sorry, at one is a snapshot of time. If you take multiple snapshots of time just to see the evolution of the restoration, that previous matrix becomes a block diagonal matrix in a modern matrix. And you cannot use the same strategies. Mixed integer programming still works. You have some structures that you are exploiting. If you take this big matrix now and put it into a stochastic mindset, in the sense that now you have scenarios and scenarios and scenarios and scenarios, that previous matrix becomes the block diagonal on another one, but you use the same technique. Because solving block diagonal matrices is much easier than solving dense matrices. We have, again, kind of the same strategy, building on 100 years of linear algebra to just solve this more efficiently. It just was not done for the infrastructure networks. So here's an example. Memphis, Tennessee is another one of those test beds that we have with NIST networks, water, gas, and power. Earthquakes from the pneumatic seismic zone. There is damage. How can you restore them? Here are examples. A variety of scenarios. The optimizer grabs the damage system and establishes a sequence of what to repair, when and where, so that you recover as fast and as cheaply as possible. This is when you have supply demand kind of at the same level. Here in the right-hand side, when you have 10% additional supply, typically we have always more supply than demand. So you see how the optimizer finds its way to bringing the system back much faster. We solve this again just with industry level solvers, CPlex, Kurobi. Kurobi was developed at Rice University, so a little bit of advertising there. And just the last two slides here. So one thing that we realized by having these systems in that block diagonal structure and by talking to the decision makers is they are really operated mainly independently. So not only they are sparsely connected, but they are operated independently for the most part. So what can we assume about others? Here are results that can be interpreted as the longer the bar, the more deviation there is, as if you really were the only game in town that you control all systems. So the more negative is more deviation from a centralized version, but in reality, we are doing things that are decentralized. So if you have more resources as you move to the right, you are better off. And if you are optimistic about your infrastructure operators to do the right thing, then things can be restored much quickly. What is being optimistic? Well, having all this pre-planning, are we going to identify the locations of interdependency? What are the critical points? Just trust that the different utilities are doing their part. Now, you just don't trust them, or they are just mean. Obviously, things are not going as well. But this is just a starting point on modeling in a decentralized fashion because it captures the reality of the decision process. So to wrap it up here, at least on this discussion, making the plug for exact, probably approximately correct, or for techniques that give you a little bit more principled results. That's at the top. Then the decentralized optimization, I think it does reflect, it dovetails nicely when you speak with the community operators or the infrastructure managers. And one thing, an approximation that is very good for those expensive mixed integer programs. Eventually, they can get very expensive. It comes from the explosive percolation in network science. It does mimic this if set in the sort of right and similar constraints. And a few other things towards the future. So the stochastic part is really dealing with uncertainties. Is what balloons our decision processes. But we don't need to shy away from those methodologies. So I'll stop it there, and I'll pass it to my colleague Yangzi to discuss more of methods and.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Very good. Okay, Janshi, no slides. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Just 1 second, Jan. I think recording. Yes, yes. Just 1 second. Okay, the recording is set up. It's just changing the. Ready?
No, you were perfect.
Ready? Okay.
Okay, good. So I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be here. So as we know, any system on Earth are known to shift abruptly or irreversibly from one state to another. Due to the climate change, weather extreme, or nature or human disasters. So the research in our lab is using network science tools, static physics, or machine learning to understand, predict, and control the resilience of complex systems. So our Ed also mentioned about the discussion about resilience many years ago. So I think it's from 2012. At that time, when I worked with Laszlo Barbasi from Northeastern, he came from the Davos Economic Forum. And then during that forum, people talk about the resilience, and then he came back to discuss with me about the resilience. And later on, Ego also come to us to discuss resilience. As he mentioned, at that time, we don't know what is resilience. So we spend a lot of time to understand what is resilience. Probably most of people here are working on the field about the resilience. Actually, in one paper in Nature in 2015, The title is called 70 Ways to Define Resilience. So it's like there are a lot of definitions. People from engineering, from psychology, from ecology, from different fields, they have different definitions of resilience. Because resilience is one important common problem in all different fields. And also networks are also very universal for different fields. So in our lab, we study the resilience of many systems. So of course, the first work was published in Nature in 2016. In that paper, we tried to define the resilience as a system ability to maintain its functionality when errors, failures occur. So it defines, I mean, that is a little bit different from the engineer resilience that is more about the recovery. Because for the engineered system, they are designed by human, and we know they will recover. But for other systems, for example, ecology, biology, the disasters or the damage, the system may not recover. For example, some people may get cancer and then cannot recover from cancer. So then we use that is more related to the tipping points of the system. But yeah, we study all different types of resilience. So in that paper, we propose one approach to understand the resilience. The approach is related to the dimension reduction approach. Martha also mentioned that, and I'm glad that can be applied to transportation. I discussed this idea with Shalom Havlin 1 year ago. Even we wrote a proposal about that, but I didn't know you already finished some results about this. That's really great. So in that work, we try to apply this dimension reduction approach to ecology, biology, and even power networks. Later on, we found people can also apply this to supply chain and also many other different fields. After that, in recent years, we have a lot of applications about the resilience in many fields. Here, I will describe a little, some of them. One application is in infrastructure systems. We studied the transportation network to the flooding. That is very different from the network robustness people studied before. Because when we talk about the flooding effect to the transportation, we need to consider all different factors. For example, how far the route is from the river or the lake, and a lot of information we need to consider. And also in that paper, in the paper published in Nature Communications, we found that the flooding may cause some abrupt phase transitions of the transportation network that is different from the continuous transition people found before when we talk about the transportation network robustness. Why this is very critical? Because it's like when the rainfall is greater than some threshold, suddenly a lot of area will be damaged. That's why predicting the critical point for the flooding will be very critical. And also from that, we can find some critical routes. If we can protect these routes, it can protect the system a lot. And later on, we also studied the transportation network to the demand. That was published in PNAS. In that paper, we studied the congestions of the transportation network because of the demand increase. And later on, we consider the combined failures of the rainfall and the demand. We also studied the transportation network to earthquakes or the airline network to the lightning hazard and many more. Not only the transportation network, we also study some social networks. For example, we study the mobility to different disasters. Let's look at for example, the COVID-19, right? Due to the COVID-19, we restrict our mobility in the beginning of the COVID. And also, we find that this restriction will decay from the distance to the pandemic center and also time. We'll be able to build a universal model to quantify this mobility behavior. And also we found that this model is universal not only to the pandemic, but to many different disasters. For example, wildfire, and also winter storms, and also the summer storm, the rainbow. The model is very universal. We validated this from the mobility data from the United States. And also we study other social systems, for example, political polarization. We know in the US, we have these two big parties. And also from the past data, we find that the political polarization becomes more and more serious from the data before. But our question is, will this be a continuous change or discontinuous change? If it's a continuous change, then we know, okay, after small damage, it just becomes a little bit more polarized. But if it is discontinuous change, it means after some damage, it will polarize to a state that is hard to recover. For example, some countries, we already know that. And we find from the model and the data, we find that the system is a discontinuous phase transition. And also we show how can we recover the system if we know the system will go to the bad state. We find that if we can introduce some events or some new issues, for example, COVID, both parties would like to do it well. And we find that if this new issue is strong enough and the people do this early, and then they can recover the system, otherwise cannot. So, and except the social system, we also apply this to study other systems, for example, biology. I also mentioned before about the cancer, right? We use our approach, the dimension reduction approach, to study the cancer, the tumors and the normal people. We use the one dimension and find that after some threshold, when the gene network reach some region, then the people become cancer and cannot recover back. We study the network and that. And also we studied in our recent paper published in, just accepted in Nature Medicine, we studied the hospital network. The hospital network, we studied the healthcare system resilience to COVID-19. We found that here in this paper, we discuss both the resilience and the adaptive ability of the healthcare system. So we found that we found that some system, for example, New York, in the first wave of the pandemic, it was damaged a lot, right? And later on it recovered. But in the second wave of the pandemic, it's like there's no such big damage to the system. It shows that New York healthcare system learned how to deal with pandemic, and then it recovered very quickly. But for other system, for example, health system, for example, Wisconsin, maybe the first wave will not damage a lot, but the second wave can cause a big damage to the health system. Then from this one, we want to quantify what are the factors to affect the resilience and the adaptability of the healthcare system. And also we study the supply chain network resilience. We use the global supply chain network, and we find that before the pandemic, the people want to increase the benefit of the supply chain. That's why they have a lot of long-range interactions, right? But after pandemic, they start to change their topology so that they can be more resilient to this to the pandemic. Except these networks, we also study quantum networks resilience, because before quantum network, for the classical network, we can use a population to describe it's the network structure resilience to some disasters or damage. But for the quantum network, it becomes more different. Then we introduced a new population called concurrence population for quantum network. So in all this work, the methodology we use is about the dimension reduction approach I mentioned before. It means in a paper published this year in Nature Physics, I give the opinion that, so as we know, many systems are so complex with many nodes and links, and they can form a very complex structure. But there are some intrinsic simplicity of these systems, so that we can map this system to a low-dimensional one. And this system can capture the macroscopic of the whole system, but reduce a lot of its complexity. So in our Nature paper, we showed that we can reduce a complex system to a 1D system. But now we show that we can introduce a system to a low-dimensional one that is greater than 1, but much less than n. So it can capture all the, macroscopic behavior, but still be simple enough. But what is the optimal dimension reduction? Currently, in the academia, there are two different directions going on. One is based on the linear algebra. For example, they use different metric theory, for example, SVD decomposition and more. The other is from network science. For example, degree-based or some degree-based dimension reduction and so on. But these two directions, it's like there are some gaps between these two. So the network science-based approach are more intuitive because we understand what's the meaning of degree. So how many number of your nearest neighbors? But the linear algebra approach has more theoretical, proofs because it's a long history, mathematical domain, but with less intuition. What is the bridge between these two? It's like there are some ongoing research on this direction. So this is all about my,
Fascinating. Thank you. So we can open it up for questions. There.
Morning. This is a question for Professor Leonardo. My name is Felipe. I come from Colombia, and I'm here working with Professor Auroop and the SDS group as a postdoc researcher. I just started 1 month ago, and I was really amazed by your talk, and many ideas came to my mind. One of those is, but I'm sure you're aware of what happened in Hidroituango in 2018. Hidroituango. So Hidroituango, for those who don't know, is one of the biggest engineering failures for power production. So the whole system collapsed, and there were many studies trying to find out the root cause. And probably the root cause, as many engineers say, there were 25% less screws. That was a failure. So this leads to one question from what you presented. Is from those algorithms, if we see Hidroituango in a retrospective way, was it possible to measure that deep uncertainty? So that will be the first question. And the second question is, there's a say that states, for one nail, we lost the horse. For the horse, we lost the message. If we lost the message, we lost the war, and we lost the kingdom. So this is a little bit like what happened in Hidroituango. So we can see that there are some of these failures that propagate on higher scales cannot be correctly captured at bigger scales, right? Is this possible to do with this kind of networks that you use? For example, I'm thinking about fractal propagation to capture this.
So I guess I'll try to be quick, trying to respond the answer. So one of the things that we really encourage is asking that question, what can go wrong? And ask all the questions possible, however unlikely or however small. Sometimes we refrain from doing so. So if we are really as rich in our development of what can go wrong, then we can evaluate the odds of those things happening. However small they could be, is still important to quantify it, because then you can realize the consequences. Things that are rare or that could be from component to a system level, those are very rare, by the way, because we have a lot of redundancies and a lot of spares, a lot of pathways, but it's not impossible. So having all that, comparing then the consequences and then the trade-offs of the possible options will lead to at least maybe identifying and not let some of those go through the cracks. Because a lot of is really our practice of engineering design for reliability is more target reliabilities. But again, those are notional numbers. So I think codes are prescriptive and we are liable by the law, but that's not enough. Codes are actually minimum standards. So we need to go beyond that for compound effects, for rate events, for hidden failure modes. We have to go beyond the minimum standard. So the examples you give are very sort of engineering driven. And I think we certainly have an opportunity to go and do on minimum.
Thank you. Anyone else? Questions?
So,
Satish.
no, please. Shubhra, go ahead.
Thank you for the fascinating presentation. Then to your comment, I mean, I used to work in oil and gas, and several years ago, a major platform failed in the Gulf of Mexico, and it turned out to be because of one bolt, a series of bolts their size, the Swiss cheese model and all that. My question was to Dr. Gao, not as a federal employee, but you said this, polarization, it's become discontinuous, and there are things that can maybe bridge that or reduce it outside of something major like COVID. Have you tested for anything else?
We didn't test the effect of COVID, but we use a model to quantify how much, effect if we use this new, issue of COVID, how can that help the system from the model, but not from the data.
Yeah, so my question partially relates to that, but so on the one hand, this is a little bit more of a philosophical question, and your presentation was very interesting from there. So on the one hand, from the academic side, we see network science pretty much solving everything, right? And
Yeah,
exactly. So you talk about quantum, you talk about ecology, you talk about everything, right? On the other hand, I think where is Igor? When he was here, he was saying that it's hard to make a case. It doesn't solve anything. So I mean, not exactly. I'm purposely slightly exaggerating his quote, but so I have to go to other areas. So what are the bounds of what network science can do and cannot do? And to Leonardo's uncertainty, can you assign some uncertainty to that, what it can or cannot do?
Fine question to me. What network cannot do? I think probably Barbasi will have better answer than me. Yeah, so.
You are being recorded.
Okay.
He's not your supervisor anymore.
So of course, usually, for example, we talk about networks, so we discuss the random networks, the skill-free networks, all these networks. These problems may not be applied to some areas, for example, material science or other areas. But in general, I think a network is very general to all different areas.
Can I challenge you on one point there?
Yes.
Just one point, just to that. Let me make the point that in your Nature paper, which all of us like very much, we are big fans of that paper. But let's say the ecology part of that paper, very interesting. The power grid part of that paper, do you think power grid people will use it? Yes.
It's very, so the power grid part, and I don't know if they will use it or not, but I think it is very important for the power engineering. And we finish, we are writing a paper, already finished a paper. We are submitting that paper about this power grid research. I discussed with people from because in RPI, Joe Chow is very famous in voltage collapse. I discussed with him about these ideas. I think they like it very much.
I see Tilo has a question and Sam has his hand up. So
Do we have time? If not, I can.
two more questions. Sam that asked first and then Tilo.
Thanks. So yeah, fascinating talks. Thank you, Leonardo. Thank you, Jiangfu. I was just wondering, I think similar vein to what asked, but what I was thinking was not that, what extent can network concepts be used, but more like if you are using network concepts in different problem settings, so how much sort of transfer learning can we do in terms of if you apply a method in a certain condition, now if you're trying to do something similar in a different context, maybe a different infrastructure, different domain where now you have less or more data, less or more context and information, can we do some form of, transfer learning across different conditions or to the extent we can? And just curious about your thoughts and.
It can be just brief. So I think in the space of network science and engineering, when we have an engineering system, we start with engineering system and it's physics driven. Network science has a lot of insights for approximations or for understanding. It's not the ultimate word because it's hard. It's hard for it to capture the water flows or the transient power flow dynamics. It's not going to happen, but they do provide a lot of insight and help us design algorithms. So just to give an example, even last week, I think there exists a fully polynomial randomized approximation scheme to network reliability. It's happened for 20 years. And last week, somebody came up with a de-randomized version of it. And it was a lot of insights from network science in local structures, minimum cuts. So I think network science is a tool that helps us reason about the problems, but it will never really get to the point that we have all the physical and dynamics and even the users now sort of meddling with the operation of the system. But they are not mutually exclusive, so I see them as really complementary.
Excellent answer. And Tilo.
Yeah, I have kind of an answer and a question. I want to answer to the question what can networks really do?
Why not?
And you can ask it also this way. What are the big things that have happened over the past 30 years? 9/11 attacks, climate change, systems biology, neuroscience, AI, mobile, the internet. Which of these have to do with networks? All of them, right? And that's amazing because at the beginning of this period, network science didn't exist. Nobody knew what a network was. If you asked somebody in the street, they were thinking you talk about fishery, right? So network are our way of thinking about complex systems. The answer is not, the question is not what can you do with networks? The question is what you can do without networks. Nothing, because you can't even think about a system. Asking what can networks do is like asking what can mass do? Is there ever a problem that was solved just with mass? No. But also there's no problem that really solved without mass ever. So it's a tool and this will not get us all the way. We need systems expertise, right? But we need this tool also.
I think we need that counter comment there.
So
But I like this.
yes, and I took my improv class. Yes, and the problem is that the word network actually is not meaningful. It's a Rorschach test. I say the word network and you think of whatever it is you want that has interconnections with it. Right? There's no such thing as a unique network for any particular system. So I agree with you, and it's a way of thinking about it. But just the fact that you're using a network perspective doesn't necessarily buy you anything automatically. I think, yes, we have to include it, but it doesn't mean that it solves anything for us necessarily.
No, it's an approach, not a method. Yes. But it's an approach that often makes things much easier to think.
So, Marta? On that note,
The truth is in between the two.
I was just going to say, hope the food is less spicy because you have a lot of fire already.
So we're woefully behind, so let's try to come back at 1:10. And the lunch is in the back, already set up for you. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I'm David.
Hi, Tilo.
Tilo.
It's like T and low. So what's your background?
So I'm an operations researcher,
Oh,
but I've studied a lot of network science. So I do a lot of infrastructure work. Spent a lot of time at the Senate Institute.